My shift as a park ranger had always been calm and predictable. Winters in the forest were particularly quiet, and few campers ever braved the cold. For those rare ones who did, we required them to call in advance. That night, the air was thick with frost, and I hadn't received a single notice of anyone setting up camp. It was supposed to be an empty forest, silent and still. I was on my final patrol when I noticed a faint glow flickering through the dense trees. At first, I assumed it was a couple of rookies unaware of the rules, which had happened more than once. Brushing it off, I walked toward the light to give them a standard warning. But as I drew closer, I sensed that something was off. The air around me grew colder, and every instinct told me to stop. The familiar smell of campfire smoke was missing. Instead, the scent in the air was sharp and metallic, tinged with something burnt and foul. I approached cautiously, stepping off the main path and into the dense underbrush. The forest was silent, so silent that my footsteps seemed to echo unnaturally. When I was close enough to see through the trees, I froze. In the middle of a small clearing, several figures in dark cloaks surrounded a large, crackling fire. They stood in a circle, each with arms raised, palms facing the sky, as if performing some kind of ritual. A low, rhythmic chanting filled the air, a sound so unnatural it sent chills down my spine. It didn't resemble any language I knew, but there was an undeniable force in the words, something dark and powerful that seemed to draw all the warmth out of the air. I crouched lower into the bushes, not daring to breathe too loudly. My rational mind told me to go back, to call for backup. But I stayed rooted in place, transfixed by the sight. The flames leapt higher as the chanting grew louder, unnaturally tall and vivid. They seemed to take on a life of their own, writhing and twisting as if something within the fire was struggling to break free. I thought I saw the vague outline of something clawed, its long, skeletal limbs reaching out through the flames, testing the air as if it were reaching into our world. And then the cloaked figures did something that defied all sense. One by one, they began to step into the fire. As each figure walked forward, they let out a piercing scream, but it wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream that seemed filled with pure terror. Yet nothing happened to them. They disappeared into the flames, one after another, vanishing as if the fire were some kind of portal swallowing them whole. The fire pulsed and flickered, and for a second, I could have sworn the clawed thing in the flames locked eyes with me, its gaze intense and intelligent. I felt an unnatural pull, like it was reaching into my mind, inviting me to step forward and join them. Panic surged through me, and I took a shaky step back, my boot crunching on the frost-covered leaves. The sound seemed deafening in the silence, and the chanting suddenly stopped. The last figure, halfway into the fire, snapped its head in my direction, though its face was hidden beneath the hood. For a moment, it stood there, silent and still, before disappearing into the flames. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the fire died down, sputtering out as if it had never been there. I didn't wait another second. I scrambled out of the underbrush and bolted back to the ranger station, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. By the time I reached the station, my colleagues could tell I was shaken. I explained what I'd seen, every detail, though I could barely believe the words coming out of my own mouth. They didn't waste any time. Together, we grabbed our flashlights and headed back to the clearing. But when we arrived, there was nothing, no fire, no footprints in the frost, no scent of smoke. It was as if the entire scene had vanished into thin air. Only the oppressive silence remained, wrapping around us like a thick blanket. As we stood there in the empty clearing, one of my colleagues nudged me and pointed at the ground. There, etched faintly into the frost-covered soil, was a single word: leave. The message was enough. We turned and left without another word, a silent understanding passing between us that none of us would speak of this again. The park was quieter than usual that winter, and the memory of that night stayed with me, as chilling as the frost on the ground. We decided to go camping one late summer evening, a spontaneous trip to escape the city. It was just a couple of friends and me, eager to unwind under the stars. We arrived at a secluded area in the woods, far from the main trails, where the trees loomed tall and thick, creating a natural canopy. As night fell, we set up our tents and built a fire, the crackling warmth contrasting with the encroaching chill of the forest. After some time, As the stars began to flicker into view, we gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. Yena suggested a nighttime hike to explore the area. Matt and Aaron agreed, their eyes glinting with the excitement of adventure. I hesitated but eventually joined, feeling the thrill of the unknown pulling me along. Equipped with flashlights, we wandered deeper into the woods. The darkness enveloped us, the only sounds being our footsteps crunching on the twigs and leaves. The light from our flashlights danced erratically among the trees, casting eerie shadows that seemed to flicker and dart away as we moved. It was all fun and games until we stumbled upon a small clearing. The moonlight spilled into the space, illuminating what looked like an old, decrepit campsite. The remnants of a fire pit sat overgrown with weeds, and the scattered remains of a few broken chairs were half buried in the earth. Suddenly, we heard a faint rustling sound coming from the trees at the edge of the clearing. We all froze, straining to listen. It was followed by a soft, rhythmic clanking, like chains being dragged across the ground. My heart raced as I turned to my friends, their expressions mirroring my own fear. It felt as if the forest itself held its breath. Without speaking, we edged closer together, our flashlights illuminating the surrounding trees. Then, through the shadows, we saw them, figures shrouded in darkness, their forms obscured by the underbrush. They wore ragged clothing and seemed to move in unison, stepping into the clearing like they were part of the very shadows themselves. Each figure carried a lantern, the flickering light revealing glimpses of gaunt faces hidden behind tattered masks. They appeared almost ghostly, chained together, their movements slow and deliberate. Panic surged within us, and we ducked behind a tree, the bark rough against my back as I pressed into the wood. I could hear the clanking of chains growing louder as the figures approached, their lanterns swinging gently as if they were searching for something or someone. They moved closer to our hiding spot, the light from their lanterns illuminating the ground around us. My breath quickened, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. Then, just as one of them stopped, the lantern light shining directly on our tree, I stifled a gasp. I had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. Then, as quickly as they had come, the figures turned and continued deeper into the woods. The sound of chains faded into the distance. We waited in silence, hearts pounding, unsure of what to do next. After several minutes, we finally dared to move, creeping back to our campsite, but what we found left us frozen in horror. Our tents were upturned, the fire pit was filled with embers, and the ground was marked with deep scratches, as if something had clawed at the earth. But the most chilling sight was the message scrawled in the dirt near our fire pit. "We will find you." I felt my stomach drop as dread settled in. We scrambled to gather our things, adrenaline propelling us forward. The forest felt alive, the trees watching as we hurriedly packed. The cool air turned frigid, and I could hear the rustling again, closer this time. In a frenzy, we piled into the car, the engine roaring to life as we drove away. We didn't stop until we were miles down the road, the forest fading into the distance. Later, we would tell ourselves it was just a trick of the mind, the wildness of the woods playing games with us. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint clinking of chains echoing in my memory. What still chills me the most is the thought that those figures might still be out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting campers, the lanterns glowing in the dark, and I wonder if they'll ever find us again. The sun was setting when we arrived at the camping site, a secluded spot deep in the woods. My friends and I were excited to escape the bustle of our daily lives. We set up our tents, built a fire, and cooked a simple meal while the forest slowly transformed into a dark, mysterious landscape. We shared stories around the flickering flames, laughing and feeling the bond of friendship strengthen with every passing hour. As night fell, the sounds of the forest grew louder. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed through the trees. Yena, always the adventurous one, suggested we explore the nearby trails. She claimed they were old ruins just a short walk away, remnants of an old homestead swallowed by nature. The idea excited us, so we grabbed our flashlights and set off into the darkness. The woods were thick, and the beam of our flashlights seemed to barely penetrate the shadows. We joked and laughed, but an unsettling feeling crept in as we ventured deeper. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes made us pause. Yena teased us, saying we were just scared of the dark, but I could feel something was off. After about half an hour of walking, we came upon a clearing. In the center stood the remains of a dilapidated cabin. Its walls were rotting, and the windows were broken, like empty eyes staring into the night. The air grew still, and an uneasy tension settled over us. We exchanged glances, each of us silently questioning whether this was a good idea. Then, just as I was about to suggest we head back, we heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. It was distant, but unmistakable. Panic washed over us. Yena, always bold, insisted we investigate. The others hesitated, but eventually, curiosity got the better of us, and we followed her deeper into the trees. As we moved cautiously, the growling grew louder, mixed with the sound of something heavy dragging along the forest floor. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Suddenly, we spotted a flicker of light in the distance, moving erratically. It wasn't a flashlight, it was something else, something that didn't belong in the woods. We crouched behind a cluster of bushes, hearts pounding in our chests. From our hidden spot, we watched in horror as a figure emerged. It was a tall man, but he was dressed in tattered clothing, chains rattling around his ankles as he walked. His face was obscured by a grotesque mask made from twisted branches and leaves, and in his hand, he held a lantern that flickered ominously. As he passed, we held our breath, hoping he wouldn't notice us. But the man stopped abruptly, turning his head slightly as if sensing our presence. My stomach dropped, Yena gasped, and I shot her a warning look. We couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The figure slowly raised his lantern, illuminating the area around him. It cast eerie shadows across the trees. My pulse raced as I thought we were about to be discovered. But instead, he turned and continued deeper into the woods, dragging something heavy behind him. I could barely breathe. Fear had paralyzed me. After a few agonizing moments, we decided we had to get out of there. We retraced our steps, moving quietly through the underbrush, desperate to return to the safety of our camp. The night felt suffocating, and every rustle of leaves sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. When we finally reached our campsite, it felt like we'd emerged from a nightmare, but the relief was short-lived. Our camp was in chaos. Tents were slashed, our gear scattered, and the fire was extinguished. A message was carved into the ground, eerily illuminated by the moonlight. You shouldn't have come here. My heart raced as I scanned the area. In the distance, I saw a flicker of lantern light again, this time closer. The realization hit me like ice water. The man was coming for us. We grabbed what we could and fled to our car, breathless with fear and disbelief. As we sped away, the adrenaline began to fade, and we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. We drove for hours, not speaking, just processing the night's events. When we finally returned home, we promised never to return to those woods. But every Halloween, as the days grow shorter and the nights darker, I remember that night. Sometimes I hear faint chains clanking in my mind, and I can't help but wonder if that figure is still out there, waiting for the next group of campers to stumble into his domain. It was supposed to be a fun weekend camping trip with friends, a chance to disconnect from the world and reconnect with nature. We drove deep into the woods, far from any civilization, surrounded by towering trees and the chirping of crickets. The sun hung low in the sky as we set up our tents, laughing and joking as we prepared for a night under the stars. As darkness fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and pine, and our laughter echoed in the stillness of the forest. As the fire crackled, Yena, always the adventurous one, suggested we take a night hike to explore the area. We hesitated for a moment, glancing at the dense blackness beyond our campfire's glow. But her enthusiasm was infectious. With flashlights in hand, we set off into the woods. The deeper we ventured, the more the atmosphere shifted. The playful sounds of our camp faded, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to absorb even our whispers. I could feel the chill in the air, a shiver creeping up my spine, but I brushed it off as excitement. Yena led the way, her flashlight beam darting across the trees, illuminating the twisted roots and gnarled branches. The darkness felt alive, watching us as we walked. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound, a strange rustling in the underbrush behind us. I turned, peering into the dark, but saw nothing. The others seemed oblivious, too caught up in their conversation. I hurried to catch up, shaking off the unease. But as we continued deeper into the forest, the rustling returned, louder this time, like something was following us. My heart raced, and I called out to the group, but my voice wavered. They paused, and Yena turned, her face illuminated by the flashlight, concern etched on her features. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice steady but low. I hesitated, unsure if I should share my paranoia. "I think something's out there," I said, forcing a laugh to mask my fear. Just then, we all heard a loud clank, metal against metal, echoing through the trees. The laughter died in our throats, replaced by a shared glance of dread. Yena shone her flashlight toward the sound, revealing a shadow moving between the trees, but it was gone before we could make out what it was. Panic rose in my chest as the chains rattled again, and we exchanged terrified looks. "Let's go back," Matt said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nods of agreement followed, and we turned, but before we could take a step, the rustling intensified, and a series of lights appeared in the distance, moving slowly toward us. Lanterns bobbed along the forest floor, casting an eerie glow on the trees. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. We ducked behind a thick bush, pressing against each other in fear. From our hiding place, we watched as figures emerged from the shadows. They were draped in white cloth, their faces obscured by grotesque masks, each carrying a lantern that flickered ominously. My stomach churned as I counted at least 10 of them, marching in eerie synchronization, chains rattling around their ankles. "What the hell are they?" Aaron muttered, eyes wide. I had no answer, but a chilling fear coursed through me. The figures continued past us, their footsteps muffled by the underbrush, the light from their lanterns flickering ominously. We held our breath, waiting for what felt like an eternity, until they finally vanished into the darkness. Once we were sure they were gone, we scrambled back to camp, adrenaline fueling our movements. As we arrived, our relief turned to horror. Our campsite was ransacked, tents overturned, the fire extinguished, and the food scattered. But it was what lay on the ground that made my blood run cold. In the dirt, words were etched with something sharp. "We know you're here." Screams of panic erupted from my friends as we grabbed what we could, the realization of our vulnerability sinking in. We bolted to the car, frantically packing our belongings, hearts racing with terror. But just as we were about to leave, Yena screamed again, pointing into the woods. There they were, those same figures, standing at the edge of the tree line, lanterns glowing in the dark. I slammed the car door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. We drove away, leaving the horrors behind. But as we passed the edge of the forest, I caught a glimpse of one of the figures standing among the trees, its mask staring blankly at us, lantern held high, as if to say we were never truly alone. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that those masked figures are still out there, waiting in the dark. I thought I had chosen the perfect spot for our weekend camping trip, deep in the woods where we could escape the city and embrace nature. My friends and I, excited and eager, set up camp as dusk fell. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and the sounds of wildlife. It felt magical, a perfect escape from our mundane lives. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. Laughter echoed through the trees, and for a moment, everything felt right. But as the stars began to twinkle above, I felt a strange unease creeping in. The forest felt alive, and not just with the usual sounds of nature. Something else lingered in the air, a palpable tension that made my skin prickle. Jenna, my adventurous friend, suggested a night hike. She had a knack for dragging us into questionable situations, and tonight was no different. Fueled by curiosity and the lingering adrenaline from the campfire, we agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and set off, the beam of light flickering over twisted branches and the underbrush. The deeper we ventured into the woods, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. I tried to shake off the feeling that we were being watched, but Jenna kept pushing forward, excited by the thrill of the unknown. Suddenly, the tranquility shattered. A loud crash echoed through the trees, followed by a series of frantic wrestlings. My heart raced as we turned to face the direction of the noise. Fear clawed at my throat as a figure emerged from the darkness, silhouetted against the dim light of our flashlights. It was a man, covered in dirt and leaves, his eyes wild and desperate. He stumbled toward us, breathing heavily, chains dragging behind him. I wanted to scream, but couldn't find my voice. The man's mouth moved, but no words came out. Panic surged within me, and I grabbed Jenna's arm, pulling her back. We stumbled over each other as we ran, adrenaline coursing through our veins. We ducked into a thicket of bushes, hearts pounding, praying we were hidden. From our hiding spot, we watched as the man continued to pace, his chains rattling. Then we noticed the lights. Tiny, flickering lanterns began to dot the forest floor, slowly illuminating a group of figures approaching from the shadows. They moved with an unnatural grace, their faces obscured by masks, their bodies swathed in tattered cloth. Each one held a lantern, casting an eerie glow that danced around the trees. I could barely breathe as they surrounded the man, whispering in hushed tones. The air grew thick with tension, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I was sure they had come for him. I squeezed Jenna's hand, fear tightening its grip on us. It felt like a nightmare, surreal and horrifying. The figures began to chant, their voices rising and falling in a haunting melody that resonated through the trees. The man's eyes widened in terror as he struggled against his chains, but it was useless. They closed in around him, and the air turned electric with anticipation. In that moment, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a mix of terror and dread. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Suddenly, one of the figures turned, their mask glinting in the lantern light, and I saw the empty eye sockets staring directly at me. I gasped and instinctively ducked lower, but not before I caught a glimpse of something chilling. The man wasn't just a victim, he was one of them. As the figures pulled him into their midst, he transformed before our eyes, joining their ranks, chains wrapping around him like a second skin. They began to move away, dragging him along, their lanterns flickering as they vanished into the darkness. We waited in silence until we were sure they were gone, our hearts still racing. We quietly retraced our steps back to camp, too terrified to speak. When we arrived, I gasped in horror. Our campsite was destroyed, tents slashed, supplies scattered, the fire smoldering. But the worst part was the message etched into the ground in what looked like dirt and ash. You should have joined us. We didn't look back as we packed our things and sprinted to the car, desperate to escape the forest grip. We never spoke of that night again, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the chains rattling in my mind, a haunting reminder of what lurked in the shadows. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend in the woods with friends. We had planned this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the chaos of daily life. I drove us deep into the forest, the road narrowing until it became a mere trail. The trees towered over us, their leaves whispering secrets in the wind. As we set up camp, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving an eerie twilight that seemed to cloak the world in mystery. After a hearty dinner, we gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. The flames danced, illuminating our faces and casting long shadows on the trees. My friends, Yena, Matt, and Aaron, were all in high spirits, but I felt a strange unease creeping in. The woods were too quiet, too still, as if they were holding their breath. Yena suggested we go for a night hike. She had a way of always being the bravest among us, and her enthusiasm was infectious. Reluctantly, we agreed, grabbing our flashlights and venturing into the darkness. The beam of light illuminated the narrow path ahead, but the darkness quickly swallowed everything beyond. As we walked, the sounds of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by an oppressive silence that gnawed at the edges of my mind. About a half-mile in, we heard it, a low, rhythmic sound, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. It stopped us in our tracks. My heart raced, and I exchanged nervous glances with my friends. Matt suggested we investigate, and against my better judgment, we moved toward the sound. As we crept through the underbrush, we stumbled upon a clearing. What we saw made my blood run cold. There, in the center, were chains linked to a massive tree stump. The chains were rusted and old, and next to them lay a small lantern flickering weakly. Panic surged through me, but before I could suggest we turn back, we heard a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. We strained to listen, and then we saw them. Figures appeared at the edge of the clearing, cloaked in shadow, moving closer. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods, and they were holding lanterns. A chill ran down my spine as I realized they were dragging chains behind them, The same sound we had heard moments before. We froze, hearts pounding, as they approached the lantern. There were at least 5 of them, silent and ominous, and I could feel a primal urge to run. Yena, however, whispered for us to stay hidden. My instincts screamed for me to flee, but the combination of fear and curiosity rooted me in place. Suddenly, one of the figures turned sharply, shining a lantern in our direction. Light flooded the area, and for a split second, I could see its face, a pale mask, expressionless and hollow. The sight sent me into a panic, and I grabbed Gina's arm, urging her to run. We bolted through the trees, the sound of chains clanking behind us as the figures began to follow. We sprinted back to camp, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. My mind raced with the image of those masked figures, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted. As we reached our campsite, we stopped, looking for signs of life. The fire had gone cold, and the area was eerily quiet, but something was off. Our tents were still standing, yet everything felt wrong. In the center of our campsite, engraved in the ground, was a message: "You shouldn't have come here." The letters were crude, as if scratched by something sharp and heavy. Panic surged again, and we scrambled to gather our belongings, adrenaline fueling our movements. Just as we finished packing, we heard the chains again, much closer this time. I glanced toward the tree line and saw the flicker of lanterns. We dashed to the car, fumbling with the keys. Our hearts racing, we jumped inside, slamming the doors as I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I backed out of the campsite. As we sped down the trail, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figures stood at the edge of the woods, their lanterns casting an eerie glow in the darkness. But as I looked closer, my stomach dropped. There was no one there. The figures had vanished, yet the lanterns still flickered ominously. The realization hit me like a cold wave. We weren't running from something in the woods. We had been lured here, and now something had marked us, watching from the darkness. The sense of dread settled in as we drove away, knowing we would never return to those woods again. Camping in the deep woods had always been my escape, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of life. I often went with a group of friends, but this time, I found myself alone. The plan was simple: set up camp, enjoy the quiet of nature, and maybe indulge in a little stargazing. Little did I know how the night would unfold. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset, a perfect spot nestled between tall pines and a clear, babbling brook. The air was crisp, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, almost as if nature was welcoming me. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and prepared some snacks as the sky shifted from orange to deep indigo. As darkness settled in, the forest transformed. The sounds of the day faded, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. I pulled out my phone to check for service, but there was nothing, just a blank screen. I chuckled at my lack of foresight. No calls, no texts, just me and the wilderness. After a few hours of sitting by the fire, I decided to take a walk. I wandered along the edge of the brook, the water shimmering under the moonlight. Everything felt peaceful until I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound echoed through the trees. I froze, straining to identify the source. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. The sound was similar to someone lightly banging a stick against a tree. Curious, I decided to follow it. As I moved deeper into the woods, the tapping grew louder, and with it came an unsettling feeling that made my skin prickle. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. An uncomfortable silence enveloped the area, the usual sounds of the forest replaced by an eerie stillness. My heart raced as I stood there, adrenaline coursing through me. I turned back toward the campsite, but paused when I caught a glimpse of something between the trees. A figure, cloaked in shadow, stood still, its head tilted slightly as if observing me. I squinted, trying to make out any features, but it was just a dark silhouette. Panic surged within me, and I took a step back. The figure moved, its outline blurring as it stepped further into the darkness, disappearing completely. I turned on my heel and ran back to the fire, my pulse pounding in my ears. I collapsed into my camping chair, trying to calm my racing heart. I reassured myself that it was probably just an animal, but the fear gnawed at me. The fire crackled loudly, illuminating the surrounding trees and keeping the darkness at bay, but my unease lingered. After a few minutes, I mustered the courage to poke the fire and try to shake off the dread. Just as I did, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. My heart sank. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it toward the sound. Nothing. I felt like a child again, afraid of the monsters lurking in the dark. As I sat there, a movement caught my eye from the corner of the clearing. A figure emerged from the trees, this time much closer. I stood up abruptly, ready to confront whatever it was. The flashlight beam revealed a woman, pale and disheveled, her eyes wide with terror. She raised her hands, trembling. "Please help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "What happened?" I asked, stepping forward. "They're coming for me," she stammered, looking over her shoulder. "I don't know what they want, but they won't stop." My instincts kicked in, and I gestured for her to sit by the fire. "You're safe here." "Who is coming?" Just then, I heard it again, the rhythmic tapping, now closer than before. The woman's eyes widened further, and she let out a small whimper. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I glanced into the darkness, the tapping now turning into a chorus of discordant knocks. Suddenly, the fire flickered violently, as if something had passed through the light. I turned to look at the woman, but she had vanished. My heart dropped, and I stumbled back, casting the flashlight all around me. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, the world tilting as panic set in. Then I heard her voice, echoing from the darkness. "They're here." I stumbled back to the tent, desperate to escape whatever was haunting me. As I unzipped the door and stepped inside, I took a breath to steady myself. I closed my eyes, hoping to wake up from this nightmare. When I opened them, the scene had changed. My campsite was now empty, devoid of any trace of my tent or the fire. All that remained was a crude drawing etched into the dirt where my campfire once burned. It reads simply, "We will find you." I stumbled back, realizing I wasn't alone. The rhythmic tapping returned, echoing through the trees, but this time I was not the one being hunted. I had become part of their twisted game, and the night was just beginning. We were excited for our weekend camping trip, the four of us eager to escape the grind of everyday life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, we arrived at our chosen spot. The site was remote, surrounded by dense woods that promised solitude and adventure. We set up our tents, made a campfire, and cooked hot dogs while sharing stories of past trips, laughing under the stars. As night enveloped the forest, a chill set in. We huddled closer to the fire, and Yano, always the jokester, suggested we play a game. She proposed truth or scare, a twist on the classic game. Each person had to tell a scary story or share a truth that no one else knew. It was all in good fun until it was my turn. With the fire crackling and shadows dancing around us, I began to tell the tale of a local legend, an old park ranger who vanished in the woods decades ago. They say he was searching for something he never found, and on moonless nights, you can still hear his chains rattling as he roams, looking for anyone who dares to camp in his territory. As I spoke, I noticed a flicker of unease in my friend's eyes, but I brushed it off, attributing it to the spooky atmosphere. After my story, we decided to take a short hike before bed. The darkness pressed in around us, the trees towering like silent sentinels. We laughed nervously, trying to keep the mood light, but the deeper we ventured into the woods, the more the sounds of nature seemed to fade. It was eerily quiet, and I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Suddenly, from somewhere in the darkness, we heard a distinct clanking sound, like metal against metal. My heart raced as we stopped in our tracks, exchanging worried glances. It echoed through the trees, louder now, like chains being dragged across the ground. Gina's face turned pale, and I could see her grip tightening around the flashlight she held. "Let's get back to camp," I suggested, trying to sound calm. We turned to retrace our steps, but the clanking grew louder, more frantic. Panic surged through us, and we broke into a sprint, the beam of our flashlights bobbing erratically as we stumbled through the underbrush. I could hear my friends gasping behind me, their breaths coming in quick bursts. Then we saw lights, flickering in the distance, moving slowly toward us through the trees. They were lanterns, glowing eerily in the dark. My instinct screamed to run, but curiosity held me in place for a moment too long. I wanted to see what was coming. The lanterns approached, revealing figures shrouded in shadows, their faces obscured by dark hoods. "Hide," I shouted, and we dove into the nearest thicket, hearts pounding in our chests. We crouched low, the clanking chains now deafening. Through the gaps in the bushes, we watched as the figures moved closer, each one carrying a lantern that illuminated their strange, unnatural movements. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. They walked in a slow, deliberate line, each step synchronized, and I could see that they were bound together by chains. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me these weren't just people. They looked like some kind of ghostly procession. As they passed, I caught a glimpse of their faces, hidden behind the hoods but pale and sunken, as if they had emerged from a grave. Then, suddenly, they stopped. One of them turned, their lantern light sweeping across the bushes where we hid. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if sensing our presence, and then continued on, the group moving as one again. We waited, terrified and breathless, until the sounds faded into the distance. When we finally emerged from our hiding place, dawn was breaking, casting a pale light through the trees. We hurried back to camp, shaken but relieved to find our tents untouched. But as we approached, a chilling sight awaited us. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered, and next to it, scratched into the dirt, were the words "You should have stayed" hidden. In that moment, a wave of terror washed over us. We packed our things in silence, hearts racing, and bolted for the car, vowing never to return. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods, and for a brief second, I could have sworn I saw the same figures standing among the trees, their lanterns flickering like dying stars. Camping was supposed to be a fun getaway for my friends and me. We were excited to escape the city, seeking adventure in the heart of nature. We hiked deep into the woods, setting up our tents by a small lake, the water shimmering under the fading sunlight. As darkness enveloped the trees, we gathered around a crackling campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. I felt a little mischievous, so I brought along a pack of mushrooms. As the stories turned creepier, I encouraged my friends to try them. Yena, Matt, and Aaron were hesitant, but ultimately gave in, giggling nervously as they consumed the little bits of magic. As the night wore on, the world around us transformed. The trees seemed to sway and breathe. Shadows twisted and danced in the firelight. After a while, Yena suggested a night walk, teasing that it would be scary. Her suggestion sent a thrill down my spine, but with the mushrooms coursing through us, we decided to embrace the adventure. We grabbed our flashlights and set off into the dark woods, the beam of our lights barely cutting through the thick, oppressive darkness. We walked deeper, laughter and whispers filling the air until an unsettling sound broke through clanking chains. It echoed through the trees, a chilling contrast to our earlier merriment. We stopped, holding our breath, listening intently. The noise came from somewhere nearby, and our excitement quickly shifted to dread. Suddenly, we noticed flickering lights in the distance. They were moving toward us, bobbing like lanterns. Panic surged through us. We darted into the nearest thicket, pressing against the damp earth as our hearts raced. Peering through the branches, we saw them figures draped in white, each one covered in chains that clanked ominously with every step. Their faces were obscured by masks, featureless and pale, and in their hands, they held lanterns that illuminated their path. We barely dared to breathe, eyes wide with fear as they shuffled past, a ghostly parade moving deeper into the forest. I could feel the terror radiating off my friends, their grip on my arm tight. We watched, frozen in place, unable to look away. The figures walked in eerie silence, the chains rattling like the ticking of a clock counting down our remaining time. Minutes felt like hours, and just when I thought they had passed us, one of the figures turned sharply, the lantern light flickering over our hiding spot. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't see us. My heart thundered in my chest, but the figure merely continued onward, joining the procession until they disappeared into the shadows. As the last light faded, we stayed huddled together, shivering from more than just the cold. We waited, fear holding us captive, until dawn's first light broke through the trees. Reluctantly, we emerged from our hiding place. Shaken but alive, we hurried back to our campsite, but our hearts sank as we drew closer. The tents were torn, supplies scattered across the ground, and our fire pit lay cold and empty. My stomach dropped as I scanned the area. Then I noticed something etched into the dirt near the fire. We will find you. The message was fresh, the letters deep and pronounced. My mind raced, recalling the figures we had seen, their glowing lanterns, and the chilling sound of chains. Without a word, we gathered what little was left of our things and ran to the car, a primal fear driving us. The forest felt alive, as if it were watching us, and the trees seemed to lean closer as we dashed down the path. We jumped into the car, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. Finally, the engine roared to life, and we sped away, not daring to look back. Months later, we tried to laugh off the incident, dismissing it as a wild camping trip that had gone too far. But sometimes, late at night, I would hear faint clanking in the distance, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I came across a post about a group that had gone missing in those very woods, their last known location eerily close to where we had camped. Suddenly, it all clicked. I shuddered, realizing that the figures we had seen were not just part of the mushrooms. They were the very reason we had run. The reason we never returned. As I lay in bed that night, the faint sound of chains echoed in my mind, and I understood. The forest had not let go of its secrets, and somewhere, those figures were still out there, waiting. The autumn sun had already dipped behind the treetops when I arrived at the remote campsite. I was the only park ranger on duty, and the silence of the forest felt heavy. I had always loved the peace of the woods, but that night, an unsettling feeling crept in like the chill of the evening air. I had just finished my evening rounds when a family of 4 set up camp nearby. They were cheerful and excited, their laughter echoing through the trees. I introduced myself and reminded them to keep food stored properly to avoid any wildlife encounters. They laughed it off, the father joking that they were just going to eat some s'mores anyway. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Later, as darkness enveloped the forest, I started my night shift, equipped with my flashlight and radio. The trees loomed larger, their shadows stretching like fingers across the ground. A gust of wind rustled the leaves, making the night feel alive, as if it were watching. The radio crackled to life, interrupting the eerie quiet. It was the father from the nearby campsite. His voice trembled as he reported strange noises outside their tent. I assured him that it was probably just a deer or a raccoon and that they should stay inside. After I hung up, I couldn't help but glance toward their campsite. The tent was dark, but I could see faint shadows moving inside. A few minutes later, I decided to check on them, wanting to ease their minds. As I walked closer, I heard a loud crash. It sounded like something heavy had fallen nearby. My heart raced. I approached the tent cautiously, shining my flashlight toward the sound. When suddenly I heard the father scream, I ran toward the tent, calling out to the family. The air felt electric, charged with fear. I reached the tent, and the father burst out, eyes wide and panicked. He shouted about something in the woods, something big. Before I could calm him down, I heard it. A low growl, unlike anything had ever encountered, reverberated through the trees. My instincts kicked in, and I ordered the family to stay close to me. We moved cautiously toward the source of the noise, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The growl echoed again, closer this time, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was followed by unsettling silence, as if the forest held its breath. Suddenly, something darted between the trees. A glimpse of movement caught my eye. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight in that direction, but it was gone. I turned to the family, urging them to stay quiet and remain alert. Just as I began to feel a sense of control, the ground shook beneath us. A massive figure emerged from the trees, towering and shadowy, its eyes glowing with a menacing light. I froze, my mind racing for an explanation. The father grabbed his children, pulling them back toward me. The creature opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and let out a deafening roar. In a panic, I turned to run, dragging the family with me. We sprinted back toward the campsite, my flashlight flickering as the creature pursued us. I could hear its heavy footsteps pounding behind us, each step a reminder that we had to escape. I led them to a clearing, hoping to find safety in the open space. As we reached the clearing, the creature stopped abruptly, as if it had hit an invisible wall. We halted in confusion, panting heavily. The father, breathing heavily, asked why it had stopped. I didn't know. I aimed my flashlight at the creature, and as the beam landed on it, The glow of its eyes flickered out. Suddenly, a blinding light enveloped the clearing, illuminating everything around us. The creature vanished. I blinked, disoriented. The family looked at me, fear still etched on their faces. I assured them we were safe, but deep down, I was shaken. As we made our way back to the campsite, I noticed something strange. The ground was undisturbed, no signs of the chase we had just experienced. We packed up quickly and returned to the park entrance. I glanced back one last time at the woods, where shadows danced in the fading light. I would never forget that night or the creature we never truly saw, and I would never understand what happened in that clearing. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, lurking just beyond the edge of the forest, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitors. It was my first week as a park ranger in a remote wilderness area, and I was eager to immerse myself in nature. The days were spent patrolling trails and checking on campsites, but the nights were different. The vastness of the woods felt both comforting and isolating. One late October evening, with the sun setting earlier and shadows growing longer, I received a call from a family camping deep in the forest. They reported hearing strange noises outside their tent. The father sounded frantic, claiming it sounded like something was circling their campsite. I quickly gathered my gear and set off down the path. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched under my boots, a stark contrast to the unease building in my stomach. As I hiked, the trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches clawing at the darkening sky. I pushed the thoughts of what might be lurking in the shadows from my mind. I had a job to do. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the family's campsite. The tent was zipped tightly, and the campfire was reduced to glowing embers. I called out to them, my voice echoing through the trees, but there was no answer. A chill ran down my spine as I unzipped the tent and peered inside. The sleeping bags were undisturbed, but the family was gone. Just then, I heard a rustling nearby. My heart raced as I turned toward the sound. I swept my flashlight over the trees and spotted movement. A figure, tall and thin, was crouched down, just beyond the light's reach. Its back was turned to me, but I could see the outline of long limbs and something glimmering in its hands. I called out again, this time my voice shaking with a mix of fear and adrenaline. The figure slowly turned its head, and I was struck by a horrifying realization. It wasn't human. Its face was a twisted caricature, elongated and with hollow eyes that seemed to swallow the light. I stumbled back, trying to suppress the urge to scream. My instincts kicked in, and I turned to run, sprinting back down the path I had just come from. Branches snapped underfoot as I fled, the sounds of the forest merging into a cacophony of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. I dared not look back. As I approached a clearing, I spotted the glimmer of my flashlight reflecting off something metallic. I skidded to a stop, and my heart dropped. It was an axe, buried in the ground near a tree stump. The sight sent a jolt of fear through me. Why was it here? Who had left it? I quickly glanced around, the growling noise from before echoing in my mind. It was getting closer. Panic surged as I turned and ran again, adrenaline pushing me forward. I finally burst out of the woods and onto the main road, gasping for breath. The sound of the rustling behind me faded into the distance. I found my truck parked by the entrance and jumped in, slamming the door shut. I fumbled for the radio, ready to call for backup. But just as I began to speak, the silence was shattered by a frantic knocking on my window. I jumped, my heart racing. It was the family I had been searching for, wide-eyed and breathless. They were alive. I opened the door, letting them inside the truck. They explained that they had heard strange noises and decided to run for help. I couldn't believe they had managed to escape. We all sat in silence for a moment, trying to calm our racing hearts. I told them about the figure I had seen and the axe I found. Their faces went pale as the father whispered that they had seen it too. They described the same gaunt creature, lurking near their tent, watching them with those hollow eyes. We shared a moment of disbelief and fear, realizing we had all encountered something sinister that night. Just as we were about to leave, the family pointed toward the forest behind us. I turned slowly, my stomach dropping. In the moonlight, the same figure stood at the edge of the tree line, holding the axe. It was staring directly at us. We all froze, unable to comprehend what we were seeing. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the woods. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the next unsuspecting campers. What had started as a simple night patrol had morphed into a nightmare, leaving us with more questions than answers. The woods were full of secrets, and I realized some of them were better left undiscovered. As a park ranger, I was accustomed to the tranquility of the woods. My shifts usually involved checking on campers, patrolling trails, and ensuring everything was in order. However, that one evening in late October, everything changed. It started innocently enough. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. I was making my rounds when I noticed a flickering light deep in the woods. At first, I assumed it was just a camper's fire, but something about it felt wrong. The light was too erratic, almost frantic. Curiosity piqued. I decided to investigate. The trail quickly disappeared, swallowed by dense foliage and thick underbrush. The deeper I ventured, the more the atmosphere changed. The chirping of crickets faded, replaced by an unsettling silence that wrapped around me like a heavy fog. My flashlight beam danced nervously among the trees, revealing nothing but shadows. I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Finally, I reached a small clearing. In the center, I found a small campfire, its flames sputtering and nearly extinguished. But there were no signs of any campers, no tents, no gear, nothing. The air grew colder, and my instinct screamed at me to leave. Just as I turned to go, I heard a low, deep growl emanating from the darkness beyond the clearing. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl came again, closer this time. I aimed my flashlight toward the sound, illuminating the trees around me. That's when I saw a figure lurking just beyond the reach of my light. It was massive, a hulking shadow with glistening eyes that reflected the light like a predator sizing up its prey. I stumbled back, adrenaline surging through my veins. I wanted to run, but fear rooted me in place. The creature stepped forward, its form becoming clearer. It had a grotesque humanoid shape, but its limbs were elongated and twisted. Just as I opened my mouth to scream, a branch snapped behind me. I turned, instinctively shining my flashlight in that direction. To my utter disbelief, I saw a camper standing there, eyes wide with terror. It was a young man, trembling as he pointed into the woods. "We have to go. It's coming." Before I could respond, the creature lunged forward, its growl echoing through the trees. We sprinted back the way I had come, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls chasing us. The woods transformed into a labyrinth of shadows as I navigated through the underbrush, trying to keep my bearings. We finally emerged onto the main trail, gasping for breath. I turned to the young man, who looked as pale as a ghost. "What was that thing?" I asked. He shook his head, his voice trembling. "I don't know. We were camping, and then we heard it. It just appeared out of nowhere." As we stood there, trying to catch our breath, the air around us grew cold again. I glanced back into the woods, my flashlight illuminating the darkness. I half expected the creature to charge at us again, but the forest was eerily quiet. The young man and I decided to hike back to the ranger station together. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the creature lurking just behind the trees. But we made it back without incident. The next morning, I reported the encounter to my supervisor. We organized a search for the creature, but found nothing. The campers who had been in the area were nowhere to be found either. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Months later, as I was going through old reports, I stumbled across a case from a decade prior. A family had gone missing in the very same woods, the last sighting being a flickering light deep in the forest. My blood ran cold as I read about the circumstances surrounding their disappearance. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of that creature haunted my thoughts. The next day, I decided to return to the clearing, hoping to find some trace of the campers. As I approached the spot, I saw something glinting in the dirt. It was a broken watch, one that looked eerily familiar. I picked it up, my breath hitching as I read the inscription. It was the same watch the young man had worn. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and in that moment, I realized the truth. The woods were not just watching, they were waiting for someone to join them. I had been a park ranger for several years, but nothing prepared me for that night. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath my boots as I patrolled the remote campground. It was late October, and most campers had left. I enjoyed the solitude of the deep woods, the silence that only nature could provide. But on that night, an unsettling feeling crept over me, like fingers of cold dread wrapping around my spine. As I checked the campsites, my radio crackled to life. The voice of another ranger broke through the static. He reported a family that had set up camp late in the day. They planned to stay overnight but had not checked in. This wasn't unusual, but my instincts told me something was off. I decided to investigate, walking deeper into the woods. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the tall trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As I approached the family's campsite, I noticed an odd stillness in the air. The chirping of crickets had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. When I reached the clearing, I found the tent still standing, but there was no sign of the family. I called out to them, but my voice echoed back with no response. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent flap, peering inside. Their belongings were scattered about: sleeping bags, cooking gear, but no people. Panic gnawed at my stomach. Suddenly, I heard rustling nearby. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight toward the sound, illuminating a small animal scurrying into the underbrush. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but then I heard a low growl coming from the tree line. The sound was unlike anything I had ever encountered, a guttural noise that sent shivers down my spine. I stepped back, trying to rationalize it. It could be a bear, I thought, but deep down, I knew this was different. The growl was closer now, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had to get back to the ranger station and call for help, but as I turned to leave, a sharp rustle came from behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the bushes. I bolted toward the path, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My flashlight beam flickered erratically as I sprinted, the shadows seeming to twist and stretch around me. I dared a glance back, but nothing was there. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing, but I pressed on, pushing through the underbrush. As I reached the main trail, I heard laughter, a child's laughter echoing from the campsite. Confused, I stopped in my tracks. The family must have returned, I thought. I called out, relief flooding through me. I turned back toward the clearing, but there was only darkness. The laughter faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Just then, a voice broke the stillness, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from all directions. Help us! I froze, the blood draining from my face. It sounded like the family. I raced back to the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, the tent was still empty. I called out again, desperation creeping into my voice. Where are you? My flashlight beam flickered wildly as I scanned the area. That's when I saw them, figures standing just beyond the tree line. They looked like the family, but they were all turned away from me, their backs facing the campsite. Are you okay? I shouted, my voice trembling. They didn't respond, just stood there motionless. I stepped closer, dread pulling in my stomach. And that's when I realized they weren't moving at all. Their clothes were tattered, and their hair hung in wild tangles. The moonlight illuminated their forms, and my breath caught in my throat. With a sudden rush of fear, I turned and ran back toward my truck. I could feel something hot on my heels, a presence that I dared not look back at. I jumped into the vehicle, slamming the door and locking it tight. My hands shook as I started the engine, and as I sped away, I caught a glimpse of the figures in my rearview mirror, standing silently, watching. Later, I reported the missing family. Search teams combed the area for days, but found no trace of them. The park closed for the season, and the other rangers reassured me that it was likely to be just a case of people getting lost, but I knew what I saw. I often wonder if they are still out there, trapped in the woods, forever whispering for help, their laughter fading into the night, their figures watching from the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too far into the dark. As a park ranger, I've learned to appreciate the serenity of the woods, but that serenity can quickly turn into dread. It was the first week of October when I received a call about a family camping deep in the woods. They'd set up their tent near a secluded lake, and the father reported strange sounds echoing through the trees, unnatural and unsettling. I assured him I would investigate and pack my gear, feeling a growing unease. It was late afternoon when I set out, the sun dipping lower and casting elongated shadows. The path twisted through dense foliage, each step echoing in the silence. The vibrant hues of autumn leaves were almost too beautiful to warrant concern. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I approached the campsite, the air thickened with tension. I spotted their tent nestled among the trees, but noticed something strange. The campsite was eerily quiet. I called out, but only the wind responded. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I pressed on, pushing aside the gnawing feeling in my stomach. The first thing I noticed was a half-empty cooler, and my heart sank. It was as if they had just left, but something felt wrong. I stepped inside the tent, half expecting to see the family gathered around, but it was empty. Their sleeping bags were laid out, but personal items were strewn around as if they had been in a hurry. A flicker of movement caught my eye from outside. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the area. That's when I heard a low, rhythmic thumping noise coming from the edge of the forest. I followed the sound, my pulse racing. The trees thickened, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. As I approached, the thumping grew louder and seemed to pulse in sync with my heartbeat. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath as I tightened my grip. The beam of light revealed a tall figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was covered in dark, matted hair, and its limbs appeared unnaturally long. I was paralyzed for a moment, and then it turned its head toward me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Before I could react, it vanished behind the trees, leaving only the echo of its thumping sound. Fear coursed through me, and I bolted back toward the campsite. I had to find the family and get them out of here. As I ran, the woods seemed to close in around me, branches clawing at my clothes, as if trying to hold me back. When I reached the campsite, I quickly grabbed my radio to call for backup, but it crackled with static. The fear clawing at my throat deepened. Just then, I heard a scream, piercing and desperate, coming from the direction of the lake. I sprinted toward the sound, praying I wasn't too late. I emerged onto the lake shore, and there they were, the family huddled together, staring wide-eyed at something in the water. I followed their gaze, and my stomach dropped. The figure I had seen earlier was now standing knee-deep in the lake, water dripping from its elongated limbs, its face obscured by shadows. In an instant, it turned its head toward us, and I felt a jolt of terror as it took a step forward, moving as fluidly as a shadow. Just then, the family scrambled back, and I shouted at them to run. I grabbed the father's arm, urging him to get his family moving. We ran back through the trees, the fear propelling us forward. I led them to a clearing where we could see the distant glow of the park's visitor center. It felt safe, and the sound of the creature faded behind us. We reached the building, breathless and terrified, but when I turned to check on them, my heart sank. The family was gone, no footprints in the mud, no sign of their presence. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had been talking to a family just moments before. I called out for them, panic flooding my senses. Then, I turned around, and there it was again, the creature. This time, it was standing right behind me, a chilling grin stretching across its face. I was frozen in place, but before I could scream, it whispered in a voice that chilled me to the bone. "You shouldn't have come here." And then it vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone, surrounded by the dense woods, knowing that whatever had taken the family would not stop until it claimed me too. I've spent countless nights patrolling the deep woods. Most nights are quiet, but there was one night that has haunted me ever since. It was mid-October, the air crisp and heavy with the scent of pine. I was on a routine patrol when the eerie stillness settled over the forest. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle and your heart race. Around 8 p.m., I got a call over the radio. A family camping nearby reported strange noises coming from the woods. The father described them as high-pitched screeches followed by low growls. Unlike anything they had ever heard, I felt a chill creep down my spine. I told them I would check it out, trying to keep my voice steady. As I hiked toward their campsite, the forest seemed to close in around me. The shadows deepened, swallowing the light from my flashlight. I could hear the wind rustling through the branches, but there was something else, a low thudding sound echoing in the distance. It felt unnatural, rhythmic, almost as if something was moving through the trees. When I finally reached the campsite, it was eerily quiet. The family's tent stood dark and still, the flickering light of their campfire casting long shadows on the ground. I called out to them, but received no reply. A knot formed in my stomach as I unzipped the tent. Inside, their belongings were scattered, but the family was gone. Their sleeping bags lay untouched, and I noticed a half-eaten bag of marshmallows abandoned by the fire. Then I heard it again, the thudding sound, now closer and more urgent. Panic surged through me. I stepped out of the tent, gripping my flashlight tightly. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to writhe, almost alive. I swept the light around, searching for any sign of the family. That's when I saw something moving between the trees. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, its shape distorted and unnatural. It looked humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its head oddly shaped. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The creature turned its head toward me, revealing eyes that glowed like embers. I stumbled back, fear clawing at my throat. The creature let out a shriek that pierced the night, a sound that sent chills racing down my spine. I turned and ran, sprinting down the path, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I could hear the thudding sound behind me, getting closer with each step. The adrenaline surged through me as I pushed myself harder. Just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I burst onto the main trail where I had parked my truck. I fumbled for the radio, breathless as I called for backup. I needed help. I needed to find that family. After what felt like an eternity, another ranger arrived. A flashlight in hand, we retraced my steps back to the campsite, but the creature was gone. I explained everything to my fellow ranger, and we searched the area thoroughly. The family was still missing. Just as we were about to give up, I noticed something unusual. A set of footprints leading away from the campsite, deep imprints in the soft ground that looked far too large to belong to any human. I followed the prints, my heart racing again. They led deeper into the woods, away from the main trails. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above us. After several minutes of walking, we found ourselves in a small clearing. In the center stood a massive tree, with its trunk gnarled and twisted, and at the base of that tree lay the family's belongings: hiking boots, a backpack, and even a stuffed animal. But there was no sign of them. As we stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I heard a soft whimper. I turned to see the ranger beside me, his face pale and ashen. Then it happened. The ground beneath us shifted, and the massive tree creaked ominously. I stumbled back as I realized the truth. The tree wasn't just a tree, it was a trap, a living thing. The roots twisted and curled, reaching out like fingers, searching for more. Suddenly, the tree shuddered violently, and I was knocked to the ground. The ranger shouted, but the sound was drowned out by a deafening roar that shook the earth. I scrambled to my feet and ran, never looking back. The next morning, the search teams found the family unharmed, wandering near the edge of the woods, unaware of what had transpired. They insisted they had only gone for a short walk and had become disoriented in the darkness. The ranger and I tried to explain, but no one believed us. They had returned unscathed, but I knew what lurked beneath the surface of those woods. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. Camping in the woods had always been a cherished tradition among my friends and me. This trip, however, felt different. The forest was eerily quiet, and even the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent. We set up camp, four of us, Yena, Matt, Aaron, and I. As night descended, the atmosphere grew thick with an unsettling tension. After dinner, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we decided to take a walk. Yena suggested we explore the woods under the moonlight, laughing nervously about how spooky it would be. Fueled by the thrill of adventure and maybe a little fear, we agreed. With flashlights in hand, we ventured deeper into the trees, the path illuminated only by the beams of our lights. Initially, we were caught up in the beauty of the night, the shimmering stars above and the soft glow of the moon filtering through the branches. But soon, the sounds of the forest began to change. A distant rustle, a snap of a twig, and the uncomfortable feeling that something was watching us settled in. The further we walked, the heavier the air felt around us. Then we heard it, a soft clanking, like metal against metal, echoing through the trees. My heart raced as I turned to my friends, their faces mirroring my unease. It seemed to be coming from the direction we had just walked, and in a moment of collective panic, we decided to hide. We ducked behind some thick bushes, our breaths shallow as we strained to hear more. What we saw next made my blood run cold. Lanterns appeared in the distance, bobbing along the forest floor, illuminating the space between the trees. Figures emerged, draped in tattered white clothing, their faces hidden behind eerie masks that seemed to glow in the lantern light. Chains rattled as they walked, shackles on their wrists and ankles clanking with every step. The procession moved slowly, the figures gliding toward our hiding spot as if they were drawn by an unseen force. My friends and I exchanged wide-eyed glances, a shared understanding of our predicament settling over us. We remained completely still, our hearts pounding in sync, the tension thick enough to slice through Dot as they passed. I could see their eyes, or rather, where their eyes should have been. The masks were hollow, devoid of any expression, and I felt an overwhelming urge to scream, but managed to suppress it. The figures moved with a haunting grace, and I wondered if they even knew we were there. They continued on, fading into the depths of the woods, leaving us shaken and terrified. We waited for what felt like an eternity before we dared to move. Finally, we crept back to our camp, only to find it in disarray. The tents were overturned, and the fire pit was smoldering as if it had just been extinguished. Fear twisted in my stomach as we approached the campsite. A cold breeze whispered through the trees, sending chills down my spine. I noticed something on the ground, half hidden by the leaves. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. Scrawled in the dirt was a message: "You should not have come here." We all froze, the weight of that ominous sentence hanging heavily in the air. I felt a sense of dread wash over me, suffocating and relentless. We hastily gathered our things, adrenaline fueling our movements, and sprinted back to the car. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves had us glancing over our shoulders, terrified of what might be lurking in the shadows. Once inside the car, we locked the doors and started the engine. As we drove away, I looked back at the trees, the place where we had just been. That's when I saw them, those figures standing at the edge of the woods, illuminated by the moonlight. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching us leave. Later that night, once we were safely back in the city, I checked my phone. A notification lit up the screen. It was a message from Yana, sent while we were in the woods. "Did you see them? They're in the trees. They know we're here." I stared at the screen, confusion washing over me. Had she seen them too? I quickly typed back, asking her what she meant. I stared at the message, waiting for her response, but the screen went dark. Then, I heard it again, the faint clanking of chains in my mind, echoing, haunting. It wasn't over. The woods were not finished with us yet. As a park ranger, I often patrolled the deeper parts of the woods where few ventured. I loved the solitude, the way the trees enveloped me like a protective embrace. But on one chilly October evening, that solitude took on a sinister edge. I was finishing my last round before heading back to the ranger station. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the setting sun painted the sky in deep oranges and purples. I had my radio tuned to the channel that connected me with other rangers, and as I walked, I felt a sense of unease creeping in. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life. A frantic voice came through. A family camping nearby reported hearing strange noises. The father described it as a low growl, followed by something heavy moving through the brush. My heart raced. I assured him I'd head their way and investigate. The family was about 1.5 miles from where I was. I picked up my pace, my flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. As I neared their campsite, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees, tall and ancient, creaked as the wind picked up. I could almost feel them watching me, the shadows lurking just beyond the reach of my light. When I finally arrived, the tent stood eerily still. I called out to the family, but there was no answer. Anxiety twisted my stomach as I unzipped the tent flap. Inside, the sleeping bags were neatly folded, and personal items were still scattered about. But no one was there. Just then, I heard a deep, guttural growl, echoing through the trees. It sent a chill down my spine. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the sound, and my beam fell on a large figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its silhouette was too thin. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out any details, but the eyes, my God, the eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light. I felt my instincts scream at me to run. I took a step back, and that seemed to provoke it. The figure stepped forward, the ground crunching beneath its weight. I bolted. I sprinted through the woods, branches clawing at my arms as I navigated the darkened path. Behind me, I could hear it following, moving with a speed that defied nature. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I burst out onto the main trail, gasping for breath as I raced toward the ranger station. When I arrived, I quickly grabbed my radio and called for backup. I relayed everything I'd seen, though my words felt jumbled and frantic. A few minutes later, another ranger arrived. We decided to head back to the campsite together, flashlights in hand. As we approached, I felt a mix of dread and relief. I wasn't alone anymore. The air was colder now, the forest seemingly holding its breath. We found the campsite just as I had left it, except now. A tent flap rustled gently in the breeze. My fellow ranger and I called out again, but still no answer. With a growing sense of foreboding, we shone our lights around, but the family was nowhere to be found. I felt a prickle of panic. The figure could be nearby. We decided to search the area, staying close to one another. As we scoured the perimeter, I noticed something out of place on the ground, a set of deep, claw-like tracks leading away from the tent. They looked disturbingly human, but with elongated fingers that should not exist. I followed the tracks, my heart racing. They led to a clearing where the trees parted, revealing a dark, swirling mist. It felt wrong, unnatural. Suddenly, from the mist, a figure emerged. I recoiled, shining my flashlight at it, but as the beam illuminated the figure, I froze. It was the family, standing perfectly still, their faces blank and eyes wide. They weren't moving, but their bodies seemed to ripple, as if made of smoke. I stumbled backward, gasping as the mist began to close in around me. The ranger grabbed my arm, pulling me away. We ran back to the campsite, leaving the mist and the eerie figures behind. When we finally reached the ranger station, I turned to look back at the clearing. It was gone. The family, the mist, everything had vanished as if it never existed. We reported it, but when the authorities searched the area, there was nothing, no tracks, no signs of the family. It was as if they were swallowed by the forest. To this day, I cannot shake the feeling that whatever I encountered that night was more than a mere shadow. It lingers in the depths of the woods, waiting, watching. The park reopened, but I can never bring myself to go back to that part of the woods. The shadows seem to whisper secrets I am too afraid to hear. I never expected my job as a park ranger to take such a terrifying turn. It was mid-autumn, and I was patrolling the deep woods that had grown dark and ominous with the season. The air was crisp, leaves crunched beneath my boots, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting eerie shadows among the trees. I was on my usual route, ensuring the trails were clear for any late-season campers. Around dusk, I received a call from a group of campers who reported strange noises near their campsite. They described it as a low growl mixed with something like human whispers. At first, I thought it might be a bear or perhaps the wind playing tricks on them, but their fear was palpable over the radio. I decided to head out and check on them. As I made my way through the thickening underbrush, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I dismissed it as nerves. After all, I had patrolled these woods countless times. I reached their campsite just as twilight faded into night. The fire was dying down, and the campers huddled around it, wide-eyed and trembling. They explained that the sounds had started shortly after sunset, echoing from the tree line. They insisted it felt like something was lurking just out of sight. I tried to calm them, suggesting it was probably just wildlife. But, as we sat around the fire, the noises began again, a low growl followed by the faintest of whispers that seemed to slither through the air. "Did you hear that?" One of the campers gasped. I nodded, my heart racing. This was more than just wildlife. I instructed everyone to stay close and keep the fire burning. As I scanned the perimeter of the clearing, the shadows began to twist and writhe in a way that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the bushes to my left. I swung my flashlight toward it, and in the beam, I caught a glimpse of something pale and elongated, disappearing behind a tree. I blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light, but the campers had seen it too. "I don't like this," one of them said, his voice trembling. "We should leave," I agreed. It felt wrong to stay any longer. As we packed up, the whispers grew louder. swirling around us like a chilling wind. I kept the flashlight aimed into the dark as we walked, trying to ignore the sensations of dread gnawing at me. As we reached the trail, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. I turned, but nothing was there. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I quickened my pace, urging the campers to do the same. The whispers intensified, echoing our fears, the sound growing nearer. Just then, a loud crack echoed through the trees, and we all jumped. I turned around to face the noise. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood a few yards away, its features distorted in the dim light. It had unnaturally long limbs, and its eyes glowed with an unsettling light. The whispers transformed into guttural sounds, incomprehensible but undeniably threatening. Instinct kicked in, and I shouted for everyone to run. We sprinted down the trail, hearts pounding in our chests, the sounds of our panicked breaths mixing with the monstrous growls behind us. We pushed through the thick underbrush, desperate to put distance between us and whatever was chasing us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon a clearing that opened up to the main road. We dashed across, collapsing in a heap on the other side. The woods loomed behind us, dark and silent. The terror suddenly stilled. As we caught our breath, I looked at the campers, trying to reassure them that we were safe now. But then, one of them pointed back toward the woods. My stomach dropped. Emerging from the tree line was not the figure we had encountered, but a group of people in costumes, their faces painted and eyes wide with laughter. It was a Halloween prank gone awry. They had been planning a haunted trail and didn't realize they had scared us off. The whispers we heard were merely their attempts to build suspense. The growls, just a well-placed speaker hidden in the bushes. I felt a mix of relief and annoyance wash over me. We were safe, but the realization left me feeling foolish. Yet even as they explained their prank, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling of dread. As I turned back toward the woods, the air felt different, heavier. I saw the shadows shift again, but this time I noticed something more unsettling. In the distance, not far from where the pranksters had emerged, the real figure stood, watching us with those glowing eyes. I had just completed my first year as a park ranger, and with summer fading, the woods had begun to quiet down. The leaves were turning, casting a kaleidoscope of color over the hiking trails, and I was preparing for the final weekend of camping season. I was patrolling a section of the forest known for its secluded beauty, a favorite spot for campers. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the faint rustle of leaves created a serene atmosphere, perfect for reflection. As evening approached, I decided to check on a group of campers who had reserved a site deep in the woods. They were known to stay up late, so I wasn't surprised when I found their campfire still crackling. I introduced myself, and they welcomed me warmly. There were 4 of them, sitting around the fire, swapping ghost stories. I joined in, sharing a few tales of my own, feeling the camaraderie that comes from being out in nature. As the night wore on, the laughter faded, and the conversations turned more serious. One of the campers, a young woman named Sarah, told a story about how her uncle had once gone missing in these very woods. She described how he had heard voices calling him deeper into the forest and never returned. The atmosphere shifted as the group exchanged uneasy glances, and I tried to reassure them that such tales were often exaggerated. After all, I was a ranger, and I had always felt safe here. As I was about to leave, I noticed something strange. A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing. I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks in the flickering firelight. I bid the campers good night, promising to check in on them in the morning. As I walked back to my patrol vehicle, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The woods felt alive in a way I hadn't experienced before, each rustle amplifying my senses. That night, I drove to a nearby ranger station and settled in, my mind still lingering on the campers' stories. I dozed off, only to be awakened by the sound of my radio crackling to life. A distressed voice broke through the static. A panic-stricken Sarah was calling for help. The signal faded in and out, but I could make out urgent pleas for assistance. I grabbed my flashlight and jumped into my truck, the adrenaline surging as I raced back to the campsite. The drive was tense, the trees looming like dark sentinels. I arrived to find the campfire now reduced to glowing embers. The tent was unzipped, but there was no sign of the campers. I called out for them, but the only response was the haunting echo of my voice in the stillness. My instincts screamed for me to search the area. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the darkness enveloped me. The beam of my flashlight sliced through the shadows, illuminating twisted roots and gnarled branches. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper, almost like a child's laughter carried on the wind. I froze, my heart racing, and strained to listen. The laughter faded into a chilling silence, replaced by a low growl emanating from the thicket nearby. Against my better judgment, I approached the sound. The growl intensified, a primal warning that sent shivers down my spine. I aimed my flashlight toward the noise and nearly dropped it when I saw a creature lurking just beyond the trees. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with elongated limbs and hollow, hungry eyes that glinted like shards of glass. Panic surged through me, and I turned to flee, the creature's growl echoing in my ears. I sprinted back to the campsite, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I knew I had to get to my truck and call for backup. Just as I reached the clearing, I heard a commotion behind me. I spun around, ready to confront whatever was chasing me, only to find the campers emerging from the trees, their faces pale with fear. They explained that they had gone for a midnight hike, drawn by the same laughter I had heard. They had stumbled upon the creature, which had terrified them into fleeing. We all scrambled into the truck, hearts pounding, and I radioed for help. As we sped away from the woods, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a fleeting moment, I saw the creature standing at the edge of the trees, its hollow eyes fixed on us, but then it vanished into the darkness. We were shaken, but grateful to have survived the night. However, as we recounted our experience back at the ranger station, we discovered that the campers had been missing for nearly 2 days. My heart sank at the realization we had encountered something supernatural in those woods, and the shadows were far more treacherous than I ever imagined. It was a crisp autumn evening when my friends and I decided to go camping deep in the woods, far away from civilization. We were a group of 4: Yana, Matt, Aaron, and me. The trees were ablaze with fall colors, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. We set up our camp near a small clearing, just off a winding path that we had traveled earlier that day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories, each one more ridiculous than the last. As the fire flickered, Yena suggested we go for a night hike. The idea sent a thrill through the group, fueled by both the adrenaline of our earlier laughter and the eerie beauty of the forest at night. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured down the dark trail, the shadows of the trees stretching ominously around us. The further we walked, the thicker the darkness became, and I could feel a strange tension in the air, like something was watching us. As we walked deeper into the woods, an unsettling noise broke the silence. It started as a faint rustling, but quickly escalated into a series of loud, clanking sounds. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The noise was accompanied by an odd flickering light that appeared in the distance. It danced like a candle, illuminating the nearby trees. "Do you see that?" Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. We all stopped, squinting into the darkness. The light grew closer, revealing a series of figures in white masks, each carrying a flickering lantern. They seemed to glide along the path, moving with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. I could see chains wrapped around their bodies, clinking together as they moved. Panic surged through us. I instinctively grabbed Gina's arm, pulling her back into the shadows of the trees. We crouched behind a thick bush, our breaths coming in quick gasps. The figures drew closer, and as they passed by, I caught a glimpse of their empty, hollow eyes staring straight ahead. My heart thundered in my chest, a primal instinct telling me to run, but fear held us frozen in place. As they moved out of sight, the air felt heavy with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were searching for something or someone. We sat in silence, barely daring to breathe, until the last of the figures disappeared into the darkness. After what felt like hours, we finally dared to emerge from our hiding place. Hearts pounding with terror, we decided it was best to return to our camp and pack up. But as we turned back, we were greeted by an even more horrifying sight. Our campsite was in disarray. Tents were ripped open, gear scattered across the ground, and the fire we had built was extinguished, save for a few dying embers. What happened? Aaron stammered, his face pale. But the worst part was what we found etched into the dirt where our fire had been. In crude letters, it read, "We know you're here. My stomach dropped, and I felt a surge of nausea. This wasn't just a prank, it was something far more sinister. Without waiting to grab our belongings, we sprinted back to the car, adrenaline driving us forward. I could hear the distant sounds of chains rattling again, echoing through the trees. Every second felt like an eternity as we stumbled toward our vehicle, fear urging us to move faster. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking as I finally managed to unlock the doors. We piled in, and I slammed the door shut, heart racing. Just as I turned the key in the ignition, a deafening bang echoed outside, as if something had slammed against the car. We screamed, instinctively ducking down as I gunned the engine and tore down the dirt path, leaving the horrors of the woods behind. As we drove further away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. To my horror, I saw the figures standing at the edge of the forest, their lanterns flickering in the darkness, watching us leave. We never spoke of that night again, but even now, I can still hear the distant clank of chains and feel the weight of those hollow eyes fixed upon me. What still haunts me, the realization that they were waiting, not just for us, but for someone else. Someone who had been there before us, and perhaps would be there again. It was a late autumn evening when I began my shift as a park ranger. The air was crisp, and the last vestiges of daylight seeped through the dense canopy of trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. I loved this time of year. The vibrant colors, the quiet that enveloped the woods as most campers had already packed up for the season. I took my first stroll down the main trail, making sure everything was in order. About an hour into my rounds, I received a radio call from a family camping near the far end of the park. They reported odd noises outside their tent, sounds that didn't match the usual wildlife. I assured them I would head over immediately. Their campsite was a good hike away, and with each step, I felt the growing tension in the air, as if the woods were holding their breath. By the time I reached their site, the sun had completely vanished. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped into the clearing. The tent was unzipped, and I called out, but no one answered. I shone my flashlight into the tent. Their belongings were scattered inside, but the family was nowhere to be found. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. That's when I heard a low growl, deep and guttural, reverberating through the trees. It sent a shiver racing up my spine. I turned off my flashlight, straining to hear better. The growl came again, louder, closer. It wasn't a bear. It felt almost human, twisted in some unnatural way. I backed out of the tent slowly, my heart pounding. As I stepped outside, the hairs on my neck stood on end. My flashlight flickered, and I could have sworn I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. I called out for the family, my voice shaky and barely audible. Then, just at the tree line, I saw a figure, tall and thin, partially obscured by darkness. It stood unnaturally still, its head tilted at an odd angle. I felt my pulse quicken. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the creature took a step forward, and I could see its face, or what I thought was a face. It was pale, featureless except for deep, hollow eye sockets. My breath caught in my throat as it let out another growl, echoing through the night. I sprinted back to my vehicle, adrenaline propelling me forward. I fumbled for the radio, trying to call for backup, but the static crackled loudly, making my heart race even faster. I finally managed to get a message out, desperate for someone to respond. I jumped into the truck and locked the doors, staring out into the abyss of trees surrounding me. Moments felt like hours, and I was about to lose hope when another ranger arrived, his headlights cutting through the darkness. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as he stepped out. I quickly explained what I had seen, my words tumbling out in a rush. He listened intently, and as we prepared to search for the family, we heard something, the unmistakable sound of laughter echoing through the trees. Confused, we followed the sound. It led us deeper into the woods, where the trees were so thick I could hardly see. Then we stumbled into a small clearing. There they were, the family, huddled around a small campfire, roasting marshmallows and laughing like nothing was wrong. I felt my heart drop. I rushed toward them, demanding to know where they had been. The father looked at me with a puzzled expression. They had heard the growl, but assumed it was just a bear and decided to wait it out. I was flooded with relief, but something felt off. As we gathered around the fire, I noticed the mother was pale, her hands trembling. She glanced nervously toward the trees. I followed her gaze, and suddenly, the air grew cold. The laughter faded, replaced by a low, haunting growl. The family's faces turned to shock as the figure stepped into the light, its movements slow and deliberate, but then it stopped, hovering at the edge of the firelight. I was sure it would attack, but instead, it turned its head and looked directly at me, those hollow eye sockets boring into my soul. Just as I opened my mouth to scream, the fire flared up brightly, and in that moment, the figure simply vanished. The family stood frozen, their faces white with fear. The growl faded into silence. We all looked at one another, unsure of what had just happened. What was real? Had I imagined the creature? Or had it truly been there? The night ended with us all packed tightly together around the campfire, the eerie silence settling around us like a shroud. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that the woods are not as empty as they seem. I hear whispers in the wind and feel eyes watching me. Whatever was lurking in the shadows that night might not be gone for good. I've spent years working as a park ranger in the deep woods. My shifts usually consisted of monitoring trails, checking campsites, and ensuring visitors adhered to safety guidelines. Autumn had set in, painting the forest in a tapestry of orange and crimson. The air felt electric, tinged with an anticipation I couldn't quite shake. On this particular evening, I was tasked with patrolling a remote campsite that had recently reported some strange disturbances. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I grabbed my flashlight and set off along the narrow trail leading to the site. The shadows grew longer, twisting into menacing shapes among the trees. The silence felt thick, almost suffocating. I brushed off the unsettling feeling and focused on my job. After all, I had encountered my fair share of oddities in the woods. When I arrived at the campsite, I noticed it was unusually quiet. The fire pit lay cold, and the tents stood like sentinels, their flaps flapping gently in the breeze. I called out to see if anyone was around, but received no answer. A tingle of unease prickled my spine. I began checking the tents one by one. The first tent was empty, save for some gear strewn about. The second tent, however, caught my attention. I unzipped the flap and peered inside. It was dark, the light from my flashlight barely illuminating the space. I stepped in and felt a chill sweep over me. The sleeping bags were rolled up, but something was off. There was a half-eaten granola bar lying on the ground, and a backpack was haphazardly tossed in the corner, as if someone had left in a hurry. My instincts kicked in, and I quickly exited the tent. I decided to check the surrounding area. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt the air grow heavier. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, but it carried with it an unsettling whisper. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I was just being paranoid. That's when I heard a faint sound, almost like a child laughing. I turned, heart pounding in my chest, and started walking towards the direction of the sound. The laughter echoed in a way that sent chills down my spine. It was innocent, yet the deeper I went into the woods, the more distorted it became. It was laced with a hint of something dark, something wrong. As I ventured deeper, I spotted a flicker of light through the trees. I followed it, thinking it might lead me to whoever had been camping. But as I drew closer, the laughter ceased, replaced by a profound silence. I stepped into a clearing and felt my breath catch in my throat. There, in the center, stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. At the base of the tree lay a circle of stones, each one covered in strange markings. I crouched to examine them, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. Just then, I heard rustling behind me. I whipped around, flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. Nothing was there. I was alone, or so I thought. Suddenly, a sharp whisper cut through the air, sending icy fingers creeping up my spine. It was a voice, chillingly familiar, echoing my name. I stumbled backward, heart racing, realizing it sounded just like my sister. Confused and terrified, I called out, asking if anyone was there. The whispers intensified, now blending into a cacophony of voices, all calling my name. My heart pounded louder, drowning out the chaos. I felt disoriented, panic threatening to take hold. Then I spotted something moving in the shadows, a figure darting between the trees. I trained my flashlight on it, revealing a face that made my blood run cold. It was a child, eyes wide and terrified, a look of pure horror etched on her face. I rushed toward her, ready to ask if she was lost. But as I reached her, she opened her mouth, and an unearthly scream erupted from her. The sound shattered the night, reverberating in my chest. I stumbled backward, realizing the child's face was not just frightened, but twisted, warped into something inhuman. I turned to run, but felt a tug on my shirt, yanking me back. I looked down to see skeletal hands emerging from the ground, grasping at me. I screamed and broke free, sprinting back toward the trail, adrenaline coursing through my veins. When I finally reached the safety of my vehicle, I locked the doors, heart racing, hands trembling. I looked back at the woods, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. The eerie laughter had returned, ringing in my ears, echoing my deepest fears. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my truck, shaken, the forest looming dark and silent around me. As dawn broke, I vowed never to return to that spot, never to speak of it again. I thought about the child I saw, and the sinister whispers that echoed through the trees. I knew one thing for certain: the woods were alive with secrets, and some truths were best left buried. The evening sun was sinking below the horizon as I patrolled the forest trails, the fading light casting long shadows between the trees. As a park ranger, I had learned to love the isolation and beauty of the deep woods, but tonight felt different. The chill in the air hinted at an approaching storm, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Around dusk, I received a call on the radio about a family camping a few miles from my current position. They reported strange noises surrounding their tent. The mother sounded terrified, insisting it was something big prowling just beyond their campsite. I assured her I would head over immediately. After a quick check of my gear, I set off down the narrow trail. The deeper I walked into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees loomed overhead, blocking out what little light remained. My flashlight illuminated only a few feet ahead, and the darkness seemed to swallow the beams whole. As I trekked onward, the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I kept my radio on, hoping to stay in touch with the family as I approached. When I reached their campsite, the first thing I noticed was the stillness. The family's tent was pitched in a small clearing, but there were no signs of life. My heart raced as I called out to them. Silence enveloped me, thick and heavy. I stepped closer and peered inside the tent, but it was empty. The sleeping bags lay undisturbed, and the gear was neatly packed. Something twisted in my gut as I wondered where they could be. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the trees nearby. I jumped, spinning around with my flashlight aimed into the darkness. The beam caught a glimpse of movement, a dark shape darting between the trees. Adrenaline surged through me. I yelled for the family, hoping they would respond, but only the wind answered. I decided to check the surrounding area. I took a few steps into the trees when I heard it, a low growl, rumbling and guttural. It sent chills down my spine. I felt like prey in a predator's territory. I called again, my voice trembling, but there was still no response. I was alone. The growling grew louder, closer. I turned to run back to the clearing, but I stumbled over a root and fell hard to the ground. My flashlight flew from my hand, clattering away into the darkness. I scrambled to my feet and frantically searched for the light. As I reached for it, I felt something brush against my arm. Panic gripped me, and I recoiled, heart racing. The flashlight flickered back to life in my hand, and as I turned, I saw it. A massive creature stood just a few feet away, its eyes reflecting the light like to glowing coals. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long. A deep growl emanated from its throat, vibrating in the air around me. My instincts screamed at me to flee, but I was frozen in place. Then, without warning, the creature lunged toward me. I ducked just in time, narrowly avoiding its grasp. I sprinted back to the tent, desperately calling for the family as I ran. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me. My lungs burned, but I pushed forward, desperate to reach safety. I burst into the clearing, and to my shock, I found the family emerging from the trees, their faces pale and wide-eyed. They looked like they had been running too. I quickly waved them over and led them back to their tent. We huddled together, and I explained what I had seen. Just then, we heard the growl again, closer this time. We scrambled into the tent, my heart pounding as I pulled the flap shut. The creature's claws scraped against the tent fabric, and I felt its weight pressing against the structure. It felt like it was toying with us, waiting for us to show ourselves. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the creature stopped. Silence enveloped us. We waited, holding our breath, unsure of what to expect. After a long moment, the family's youngest child whispered, "Where did it go?" I took a deep breath and slowly opened the tent flap. Peering out, the clearing was empty. The creature had vanished. As we stumbled out into the moonlight, I noticed something strange on the ground, a footprint, but not a normal one. It was human-sized and oddly shaped, as if someone had been standing there all along. I turned to the family, and their faces mirrored my shock. What had chased us? Where had it gone? We looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between us. The true horror of the night was not the creature itself, but the fact that it could take on the form of a human. It could be anyone, lurking in the woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting group to stumble upon its domain. I have always loved the deep woods, the way the tall trees whisper secrets as the wind moves through them. As a park ranger, my job was to protect these woods and the visitors who came to enjoy them. It was mid-October when I received a call about a group of campers who hadn't checked in. I grabbed my gear and set out into the forest, ready to find them. The sun had set by the time I reached their designated campsite. The fire pit was cold, and the tents were still pitched, but the area was unnaturally quiet. No laughter, no sounds of rustling gear. I called out, hoping for a response, but silence met me. I stepped inside the nearest tent. Their sleeping bags were untouched, and the gear was scattered but still there. My heart raced as I realized something was wrong. I scanned the area, looking for signs of a struggle, but found nothing except a small trail leading deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow it. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows that danced in the fading light. The air grew heavier, the sounds of the forest fading into an eerie stillness. As I walked, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I stopped and turned, half expecting to see a fellow ranger or the campers behind me, but I was alone. I pressed on, my instinct screaming at me to turn back. I heard a snap of a twig behind me and spun around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The trail led me to a small clearing where the moonlight spilled onto the ground, illuminating what looked like a campsite. There was a fire pit, but it hadn't been used in a long time. I approached cautiously, scanning for any signs of life. That's when I saw a shape in the shadows near the tree line. I squinted, trying to make it out, and my heart stopped. It looked like a person, but something was off. The figure was hunched over, and as I stepped closer, I could see it was covered in dirt and leaves. My breath caught in my throat. I called out, trying to sound brave. "Hello. Are you okay?" The figure turned slowly, its face obscured by hair and grime. It opened its mouth to speak, but what came out was a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, heart racing. The figure lunged forward, and I turned to run, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I sprinted back toward the main path, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I ran, branches whipped at my face, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. I could hear the figure crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground. My mind raced as I tried to formulate a plan. I had to reach the other rangers at the visitor center. They would know what to do. Suddenly, I tripped over a root and fell hard onto the forest floor. I rolled over just in time to see the figure looming above me, its breath heavy and ragged. In a moment of sheer desperation, I reached for my flashlight and shone it directly at the figure. The light caught its face, and I felt a jolt of horror as I recognized it. It was one of the campers, but not as I remembered. His eyes were wide with fear, and he was caked in mud and leaves. I stumbled back, trying to comprehend what was happening. "Where are the others?" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. The camper's expression shifted, a look of terror on his face. He pointed behind me, and as I turned, I froze. The rest of the campers stood at the edge of the clearing, but they were not alone. A group of twisted figures circled them, their bodies unnaturally contorted, faces hidden beneath matted hair. As the figures moved closer, I heard the unmistakable sound of laughter echoing through the trees, but it wasn't the joyous laughter of campers. It was taunting, sinister. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized the truth. The campers were playing a game of sick, twisted game in the dark, luring me in. The laughter crescendoed, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by fear. But as I stood there, I remembered my training. I was a park ranger, not a victim. I turned and ran, this time not looking back. I burst through the tree line and onto the main path, gasping for air. I kept running until I reached the visitor center, where I collapsed against the door, heart pounding. I told my fellow rangers everything, but they only stared at me, confusion in their eyes. I knew what I saw, but when we returned to the campsite, there was nothing. No campers, no signs of struggle, just an empty campsite in the moonlight. It was as if they had never existed at all. To this day, I still patrol those woods, and when the wind whispers through the trees, I hear their laughter echoing in the night. I know they are still out there, somewhere in the deep woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to join their game. As a park ranger, I had learned to love the solitude of the deep woods. The towering trees and the whispering winds had a calming effect, making it easy to forget the chaos of the outside world. However, there was something about that particular night that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep indigo, and the shadows grew longer and more menacing. I was on my usual patrol route, a winding trail that led through some of the densest parts of the forest. A few campers were set up near the river, and as I passed, I waved to them. They seemed lively, roasting marshmallows and laughing under the stars, but their joy felt distant as I continued my rounds. I stopped for a moment to admire the peaceful scene, but an unsettling chill crept over me, cutting through the warmth of my uniform. As I moved deeper into the woods, the sounds of nature faded. The rustling of leaves and chirping of crickets fell silent. I felt a weight in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. My flashlight flickered, and I tightened my grip on it, feeling a strange sense of urgency to finish my patrol. Suddenly, I heard a crack, sharp and echoing. I froze, scanning the darkness around me. It could have been a branch breaking, but it sounded too deliberate. I called out, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that was settling in my stomach. No response, just the unnerving stillness of the woods. Then I saw it. A figure, barely illuminated by my flashlight, standing between the trees. It was tall and gaunt, its arms impossibly long, almost scraping against the ground. My heart raced, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The figure seemed to watch me, its face obscured by shadow. Just when I thought to turn and run, it vanished, melting into the darkness as if it had never been there. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks. I continued along the trail, but the oppressive silence returned, heavier than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I quickened my pace, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Minutes felt like hours as I made my way back to the campsite. When I finally arrived, the campers were gone, their fire reduced to smoldering embers. I scanned the area, calling out for them, but the only answer was the echo of my voice against the trees. Panic rose within me. Where could they have gone? As I moved closer to the riverbank, I noticed something glimmering in the dying light. It was a small, metallic object, a keychain shaped like a bear. It didn't belong to me, and I had never seen it before. The realization sent a jolt of fear through me. I turned to head back to my truck, but a noise stopped me in my tracks. Laughter. It was distant and warped, almost childlike, but it made my blood run cold. I hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the responsibility to search for the campers. Following the sound, I ventured toward the river. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the trees, and my flashlight flickered again. In a clearing near the water, I saw them. The campers were standing in a circle, their backs to me, seemingly oblivious to my presence. Relief washed over me, but as I approached, I felt an unnatural chill. The laughter stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence. I called out, but they didn't turn around. When I was close enough to see their faces, my heart dropped. They were smiling, but it was not the joyful smile of campers. Their eyes were vacant, as if they were in a trance. In that moment, the world around me shifted, and I realized they weren't alone. The tall figure I had seen earlier loomed behind them, its arms outstretched, almost cradling them in an embrace. Instinct kicked in. I shouted at them to run, my voice breaking through the silence. They snapped out of their stupor and turned to me, their eyes wide with fear. We bolted together, racing back through the trees, my flashlight flickering wildly. I didn't stop running until we reached my truck. I ushered the campers inside, still glancing back at the dark woods, half expecting the figure to appear again. I drove us out of the park in silence, my heart pounding in my chest. As we reached the edge of the forest, the air seemed to clear. The campers thanked me for saving them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in them, that they had left a part of themselves behind in the woods. And even as I drove away, I knew the woods held their secrets tight, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too deep into their grasp. As a park ranger, I had always been drawn to the solitude of the deep woods. The crisp air, the sounds of nature, and the occasional visit from campers made the job rewarding. One particular October evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I received a call over the radio. A family had set up camp near a remote area, and they were anxious about strange noises coming from the woods. I assured them I would investigate and headed out with my flashlight and gear. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the darker it became. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their branches whispering secrets in the wind. I found the campsite nestled among the pines, a flickering campfire barely illuminating the anxious faces of the family. They were huddled close together, their expressions a mix of fear and concern. I asked what they had heard, and the father, his voice trembling, described a low growl and snapping branches echoing from the woods. The mother clutched her children, eyes wide with terror. I promised to check the perimeter and reassured them that it was likely just a bear or some other wildlife. The family nodded but remained visibly shaken. As I walked beyond their camp, the forest felt alive, each rustle amplifying my anxiety. I swept my flashlight across the darkened trees, scanning for movement. The growling had subsided, replaced by an eerie silence that set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After about 20 minutes of searching, I returned to the family. They looked relieved to see me, but were still on high alert. I suggested they stay close to the fire and try to get some rest while I kept watch. I positioned myself a few yards from their tent, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in around me. As the hours passed, the silence was punctuated by the occasional crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl. Then, just as I began to relax, I heard it again, a low growl, deeper this time, resonating through the trees. My heart raced as I shined my flashlight toward the sound, illuminating nothing but the shadows of the forest. I took a deep breath and walked toward the sound, my senses heightened. The growl was now accompanied by snapping twigs. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing an unsettling sight. A tall figure stood at the edge of the trees, its outline indistinct. It looked almost human, but something was wrong. It was too tall, too slender, and it didn't move like a person. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response came, just a low growl that echoed back to me. Suddenly, the figure lunged toward me, and I stumbled backward, the beam of my flashlight flickering as I tripped over a root. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and ran back to the camp. The family was awake, eyes wide with fear. I told them to pack their things quickly, whatever it was in the woods. I could feel it was not friendly. They hurriedly stuffed their belongings into their bags, their hands trembling. As they finished, I led them to the path back to my truck, keeping my flashlight trained on the darkened trees. Just as we reached the trailhead, the air grew cold, and I turned back to glance at the woods. The figure stood just beyond the tree line, watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine, but pushed the family forward. We hurried to the truck, and I fumbled for the keys, my fingers shaking. Just as I got the door open, a loud crash echoed from the forest, followed by a terrifying roar. I threw the family inside and slammed the door. I could feel the adrenaline surging through me as I started the engine. The headlights illuminated the edge of the woods, revealing the figure again, closer this time, its face twisted in a grotesque grin. I backed out and drove away as fast as I could. The family was silent, and the only sound was the hum of the engine. Finally, I turned to them and asked if they had seen anything. They exchanged confused looks, and then began to speak. The father insisted he had seen the figure, But the children only remembered shadows. The mother looked at me, her eyes wide. Then she pointed to the back of the truck. I turned, and my stomach dropped. There was a face pressed against the window, twisted and contorted, mirroring the grotesque smile I had seen earlier. The moment my heart stopped, the face vanished, leaving only the darkness behind. We all sat in stunned silence, realizing that whatever had been watching us was still out there, lingering just beyond the reach of our light. The sun had set behind the trees, casting long shadows over the campsite as I finished my rounds. As a park ranger, I often patrolled the woods at night, but something about this evening felt different. The air was thick, and the wind whispered through the branches like an ominous warning. It was late October, and the chill in the air hinted at winter's approach. I was on my way back to the main office when I heard a faint, desperate cry echoing through the woods. It was unlike any animal call I had ever heard. I froze, straining my ears to catch it again. There it was, a chilling scream followed by a rustling in the bushes nearby. My instincts kicked in, and I grabbed my flashlight, turning toward the sound. I had always been taught to investigate, to help anyone in trouble. I began to walk slowly toward the noise, each step filled with uncertainty. As I moved deeper into the trees, the darkness enveloped me, and my flashlight beam flickered against the trunks. The scream came again, more frantic this time, urging me to hurry. I rounded a large oak and found myself at a small clearing. In the center was a campsite with a flickering fire, its warmth contrasting sharply with the chill in the air. I stepped closer, my heart racing as I called out to see if anyone was there. "Hello? Is anyone there?" No answer. The campsite was empty, the tent still pitched, and the fire crackling quietly. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. As I turned to leave, I heard a sound behind me, a quick rustle of leaves, followed by an unmistakable growl. My breath hitched in my throat, and I swung the flashlight around, illuminating the dense tree line. I saw nothing, only the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I was about to turn back when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure darted between the trees, just beyond the light's reach. My heart raced as fear gripped me. I called out again, "Who's there?" "Show yourself." The growl came closer, a low rumble that reverberated in my chest. I felt a surge of adrenaline, and against my better judgment, I followed the sound. I stepped cautiously toward the trees where I had seen the figure, every instinct telling me to turn back. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I spotted a flash of white, a shirt or a jacket vanishing deeper into the woods. I called after it, but there was only silence. Then, I noticed something on the ground, a child's teddy bear, its button eyes staring up at me, unblinking. My stomach twisted, a chill ran down my spine. Where had the child gone? Before I could dwell on the bear, the growl returned, this time much closer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My flashlight flickered, and the beam caught something moving in the darkness. A large figure emerged from the shadows, its form grotesque and misshapen. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. It was a man, but not just any man. His limbs were elongated, and his skin appeared stretched over his bones. He grinned at me, revealing rows of jagged teeth, the moonlight glinting off them. He raised a hand as if to wave, but it was all wrong. I turned and ran, adrenaline propelling me through the trees. I could hear him behind me, his laughter echoing through the woods, sending ice through my veins. The path was familiar, but the fear twisted my perception. I raced past the empty campsite, barely glancing back, praying I could reach the main office. Just as I broke through the trees, I stumbled onto the gravel road, gasping for breath. I turned to look back, expecting to see the twisted figure closing in on me. But the woods were quiet again, as if nothing had ever happened. The campsite remained untouched, the fire still crackling softly. I made it back to the office, heart pounding, ready to call for help. But as I reached for the door, I froze. In the office window stood a child, her face pale and expressionless. It was the same girl whose teddy bear I had found. She raised her hand and pointed at me, her finger tracing a line from my chest to her throat. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. The man I had seen was not just a creature. He was a part of something much darker. I turned to run again, but the door slammed shut behind me, locking me inside with the specter of the forest's lost souls. I prided myself on being familiar with every inch of the woods. It was early October when I was assigned to a remote camping area, known for its beautiful fall foliage. The leaves were bursting with color, and the air was crisp. I looked forward to a quiet night under the stars. I set up my tent near the edge of a clearing, a safe distance from the campsite where a family had pitched their tent. They were friendly, two parents with two kids, eager to explore the woods. As night fell, the crackling fire provided a warm glow. I exchanged stories with them while they roasted marshmallows. When the kids were finally asleep, I said goodnight and retreated to my tent, hoping for a peaceful evening. The tranquility of the woods quickly turned unsettling. I heard strange noises drifting through the trees. A low rustling at first, then the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was just the wind or perhaps a deer, but the air felt charged with tension. I peered out of my tent, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. A sudden snap of a branch jolted me upright. My heart raced. I was certain something was watching me. I crawled out of my tent, trying to quiet my breathing. Listening intently, that's when I heard it. A faint whimpering, almost childlike, coming from the direction of the family's tent. I called out to them, but there was no response. The whimpering grew louder, echoing through the trees. Compelled by a mix of concern and fear, I cautiously approached their tent. It was unzipped slightly, and I pushed it open, ready to check on the family. The inside was empty, the sleeping bag still warm. Confused, I turned back toward my tent, but as I did, the whimpering stopped. Silence enveloped the woods, thick and suffocating. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity held me in place. Suddenly, I heard a high-pitched, gleeful sound that sent chills down my spine. It echoed through the trees, followed by more laughter. It was coming from the deeper woods. I knew the area well. There were no trails leading that way. Ignoring my better judgment, I followed the sound, pushing through the underbrush. With each step, the laughter turned to taunts, mocking me. "Come play with us," they seemed to say. I stumbled, catching my foot on a root, and I fell hard onto the ground. As I got up, I heard footsteps behind me, soft but deliberate. My heart raced as I turned to face whatever was pursuing me. What I saw made my blood run cold. Standing there were two children, their clothes tattered and dirty, faces pale and expressionless. They stared at me with hollow eyes, not a hint of a smile. My breath caught in my throat. They didn't belong here. I felt a surge of panic, my instincts screaming at me to run. Just as I turned to flee, a figure darted past the trees, tall and dark, its form indistinguishable. I sprinted back toward the campsite, my heart pounding in my ears. Reaching my tent, I flung myself inside and zipped it up, my hands trembling. I fumbled for my radio, calling for backup. There was no response. I could only hear my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. Just when I thought I was safe, I heard the soft laughter again, right outside my tent. "Come play with us," the voice sang, sweet yet sinister. I held my breath, clutching my flashlight, every fiber of my being urging me to stay quiet. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of something scraping against the tent. I braced myself for the worst. Suddenly, the tent shook violently. I gasped, and the laughter returned, louder and more manic. "We're here," it echoed. I squeezed my eyes shut, counting the seconds until morning, praying for dawn to break. When the sun finally rose, the light spilled into my tent, illuminating the scene outside. I unzipped the entrance slowly, half expecting the dark figure or the children to be waiting. Instead, I found the campsite abandoned. The family's tent lay empty, but what caught my eye was the ground, marked with deep, claw-like scratches leading into the woods. As I stepped outside, I noticed something on the ground. A child's teddy bear lay there, its button eye missing. My heart sank. I turned to look back at the woods, now peaceful and serene, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. I quickly packed my things, determined to report what I had encountered. As I made my way back to my truck, I glanced back one last time at the woods, and for a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw the shadows of two children peering out from the trees, their laughter echoing in the wind. We had been planning this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the chaos of city life and immerse ourselves in nature. My friends and I arrived at the campsite just before sunset, setting up our tents in a secluded area surrounded by towering trees. The air was crisp and fresh, filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. We spent the early evening cooking over the fire, laughing and sharing stories, while the stars began to prick the darkening sky. As darkness settled in, the atmosphere shifted. My friend Lucas, always the jokester, suggested we play a game of truth or dare to spice things up. Amid laughter and playful taunts, Yena, my adventurous friend, dared us to take a night hike into the woods. With a mix of excitement and trepidation, we agreed, grabbing our flashlights and heading into the shadows. The deeper we ventured, the more the forest came alive. The trees loomed around us, their branches creaking in the wind like ghostly whispers. As we walked, I felt an unsettling sensation, like we were being watched. I brushed it off as nerves, convincing myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on my mind. We wandered for what felt like an eternity, our laughter fading as we noticed the forest growing eerily quiet. Just then, a sharp sound pierced the silence, a loud crack, like something heavy breaking through the branches. We all froze, shining our flashlights toward the noise. In the distance, we saw a flicker of light, like a lantern bobbing between the trees. "What is that?" I whispered, my heart racing. Lucas squinted into the darkness, a grin creeping across his face. "Probably just some campers. Let's check it out." Despite my instincts telling me to turn back, curiosity got the better of us. We crept through the underbrush, the flickering light growing brighter as we approached. The air became thick with tension, each step feeling like a mistake. Then, out of nowhere, the lights vanished. "Where did it go?" Yena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before we could answer, the sounds of chains rattling filled the air, sending chills down my spine. Panic washed over us, and we instinctively dove behind a thick bush. Heart pounding, we peered out to see what was happening. My mind raced as I fought to control my breathing. Then we saw them. Figures cloaked in dark, tattered clothing emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by grotesque masks that glimmered in the darkness. Each figure was shackled, chains dragging behind them as they moved with a disturbing, slow grace. Lanterns hung from their hands, illuminating their path and casting haunting shadows on the trees. My stomach dropped as I realized we were not supposed to be here. My instincts screamed for us to run, but we were frozen in place, horror rendering us immobile. The figures shuffled closer, their chains clanking ominously, and for a moment, it felt like the world around us had shrunk to just us and them. I felt Gina's grip tighten on my arm, her nails digging into my skin. I opened my mouth to whisper something reassuring, but no words came. Instead, we watched, breathless, as the procession passed mere feet from our hiding place. I thought I saw one of them glance in our direction, but the lantern's light obscured their eyes. Once the figures moved on, we wasted no time scrambling back the way we came. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as we raced through the underbrush, branches clawing at our clothes. We burst out of the trees, breathless and terrified, collapsing beside our campfire. But when we reached our campsite, we were met with a shocking sight. Our tents lay toppled, gear scattered across the ground. The fire was extinguished, its embers barely glowing. As we scrambled to gather our things, I noticed something carved into the dirt near the fire pit. "You should not have come." A wave of fear washed over us, and we grabbed our belongings in a frenzy, not bothering to gather everything. As we made our way to the car, I glanced back at the campsite one last time. There was no sign of the figures, but the air felt thick with their presence. We drove away, hearts pounding, vowing never to return. But, as we sped down the winding road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a flickering light. It faded quickly, but the sense of dread remained. What if those figures had followed us? What if they were still watching? The dark woods behind us seemed to breathe, hiding secrets I hoped never to uncover. The night had settled in the forest like a heavy blanket, and as a park ranger, I was used to the eerie calm that enveloped the woods after sunset. The campgrounds were closed for the season, but I had to make my rounds to ensure no one had sneaked in for an illicit camping trip. The air was crisp, and the silence was almost deafening. My flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating the twisted branches and underbrush. About an hour into my patrol, I noticed something unusual, a tent set up deep in the woods, far from the designated camping area. My heart raced. The site was supposed to be closed for the season, and no one should be there. I approached cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. As I got closer, I could see the tent was unzipped but empty. The campfire pit lay cold and dark, a few charred logs scattered around. I scanned the area, calling out if anyone was there, but only the wind answered. I was about to turn back when I noticed a backpack near the tent, half open, and inside, I caught a glimpse of a child's drawing. It was crude but depicted a family camping. My gut twisted. Suddenly, a sound pierced the silence, laughter. Distant yet unmistakable, it echoed through the trees, high-pitched and childish. I turned, flashlight beam sweeping the darkness. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Children shouldn't be out here alone, especially in the dead of night. I made my way toward the sound, heart pounding. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the laughter faded, replaced by a chilling stillness. Then, I heard something else, a low growl. Unlike anything I had heard before, it sent a bolt of fear through me. I raised my flashlight higher, trying to see beyond the trees, but nothing moved. I hesitated, trying to rationalize the noise, convincing myself it was just an animal. With a deep breath, I continued, hoping to find the children and bring them back to safety. I stumbled into a small clearing and spotted something that made my blood run cold. There, among the foliage, stood a tall figure, its back turned to me. It wore what appeared to be a tattered, oversized sweater, the hem dragging along the ground. I called out, but it didn't move. Instead, it seemed to shift slightly, as if sensing my presence. I felt the air grow heavier, and a chill swept over me. My instinct screamed to run, but I couldn't leave without understanding what was happening. I took a cautious step forward, and the figure suddenly turned around. My flashlight flickered against its face, a twisted, unsettling mask that was neither human nor animal. Its eyes were sunken and empty, and it opened its mouth to let out a haunting sound that mimicked laughter. The growl I heard earlier grew louder, but I realized it wasn't coming from the figure. Panic surged through me as I turned to flee, heart racing. I crashed through the underbrush, branches snagging at my clothes. I sprinted back toward the path, but the laughter followed me, echoing through the trees, getting louder with each step. As I emerged onto the main trail, gasping for breath, I nearly collided with a family of 3 parents and a young child, their eyes wide with confusion. They must have arrived just as I was fleeing. I hurriedly explained what I had seen, the laughter, the figure. They listened, faces pale and frightened, but before I could convince them to leave, the laughter echoed again, louder this time, and the figure emerged from the tree line behind them. I shouted for them to run, and they turned in terror. The family sprinted down the path as I grabbed my radio, frantically calling for backup. I didn't look back until I reached the main ranger station, heart pounding. When the other rangers arrived, we formed a search party, but the woods were silent. We combed the area, but there was no sign of the figure, the tent, or the family I had seen. Hours passed with no trace, and as dawn broke, the sun illuminated the woods with a haunting beauty. Later, as we gathered to regroup, I heard the same high-pitched laughter wafting through the trees, sending chills down my spine. I turned to my fellow rangers, trying to shake off the growing dread. As we discussed the plan, I caught a glimpse of the child from the family had encountered earlier, standing at the edge of the woods, a grin on his face. But it wasn't just any grin. It was the same twisted smile I had seen on the figure. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. The child wasn't lost. He was part of whatever was lurking in the woods, and now they had returned, watching, waiting. I had no idea what horrors lay ahead. The laughter echoed again, and I felt the woods close and around me. I had always loved the solitude of the woods. As a park ranger, my job was to protect these natural wonders, but I also enjoyed the peace that came with the deep trees and endless trails. However, my perspective shifted during a chilling autumn night that I still can't shake. It was late October when the leaves transformed into brilliant reds and golds, drawing visitors to the park for one last glimpse before winter. I was scheduled for a night shift, checking the campsites and ensuring everyone was safe. The chill in the air hinted at an approaching storm, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I made my rounds. The campgrounds were mostly empty. The few campers that remained were huddled around their fires, sharing ghost stories. I smiled at their laughter, but it faded quickly as I walked deeper into the woods. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, and a sense of unease began creeping in. About an hour into my shift, I heard rustling in the bushes nearby. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was unnerving, almost deliberate. I shone my flashlight toward the noise, but only darkness greeted me. I hesitated, but the sound stopped, and I dismissed it as a deer or some other animal. I continued my patrol, but that feeling of being watched lingered. When I reached the farthest campsite, I noticed a flickering light. I approached cautiously, thinking it might be an unattended fire. Instead, I found a tent with the flap wide open and no one around. Inside, there were scattered belongings and a half-eaten sandwich lying on the ground, as if someone had left in a hurry. My instincts kicked in. Something felt very wrong. I called out for the campers, but there was no response. Just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I decided to check the nearby trails, but as I walked away from the campsite, I heard it again, a low, guttural growl echoing through the trees. It sent chills down my spine, but I pressed on, trying to rationalize it as my imagination. The forest seemed to darken as the wind picked up, carrying a sudden coldness that wrapped around me. I hurried back to the campsite, but the tent was still empty. Panic began to set in as I fumbled for my radio to call for backup, but the device crackled with static. I was alone. I decided to head back to the main road, thinking I could catch a passing ranger or even a hiker. But the deeper I walked, the more disoriented I felt. The trees loomed overhead, blocking out any trace of moonlight, and I realized I had lost my way. The growl returned, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of something heavy moving through the brush. My heart raced as I turned to run, but then I saw a figure standing in the shadows, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall and emaciated, with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed like cold embers in the dark. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. My instincts kicked in, and I took off in the opposite direction, adrenaline coursing through me. As I ran, branches snagged at my clothes, and the underbrush crunched beneath my feet. The growling intensified behind me, chasing me through the maze of trees. Just when I thought I was safe, I tripped over a root and fell. The wind knocked out of me. I scrambled to my feet and glanced back. The figure had stopped, but I could feel its gaze boring into my back. Desperate, I sprinted toward a clearing, praying it would lead me to safety. Bursting into the open, I spotted the campers I had seen earlier. They were standing by their fire, but something was off. Their faces were blank, eyes wide and unblinking. They stared past me into the darkness of the woods. I called out to them, but they didn't respond. I turned to see the figure emerge from the trees, and the campers began to scream. I felt a wave of terror wash over me as I realized the campers weren't frozen in fear. They were entranced, caught in some horrifying spell. In that moment, the figure lunged at them, but just before it could reach them, it vanished into thin air. The campers blinked and suddenly returned to normal, confusion etched on their faces. I didn't know if I was dreaming or if I had lost my mind, but the figure was gone, leaving only an echo of its growl behind. The campers recounted their own experiences of feeling watched, of shadows moving just out of sight. We all made it back to the ranger station that night, shaken but alive, leaving the mystery of the woods behind us. Yet sometimes, as I patrol the park, I catch glimpses of glowing eyes watching from the trees, and I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there, waiting. I had been a park ranger for a few years, spending countless nights in the woods and feeling a sense of peace in the rustling leaves and the sounds of nature. But that October night, everything changed. The sky was dark, thick clouds cloaking the moon, and the air was heavy with an unsettling stillness. As I patrolled the trails, the crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound, making me hyper-aware of my surroundings. I was nearing a remote campsite when my radio crackled to life. A distressed voice came through. A group of campers had reported hearing strange noises outside their tents. The father insisted it sounded like someone or something was moving around their campsite, heavy footfalls and a low growl. I tried to calm him down, assuring him that it was probably just a bear, but I could hear the fear in his voice. After gathering my gear, I set off toward the campsite. The path was winding and overgrown, making it hard to see far ahead. With my flashlight cutting through the darkness, the trees cast long, eerie shadows that danced around me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I pressed forward, the feeling of being watched creeping in. When I finally reached their campsite, the first thing I noticed was the unsettling silence. I called out, but there was no response. I stepped closer and found the tent zipped up tight, a warning sign that sent a chill down my spine. I unzipped the door and peeked inside. It was empty, the sleeping bags neatly arranged as if no one had ever been there. My heart raced as I turned to look around the campsite. Suddenly, I heard a rustling noise from the bushes nearby. I whipped around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, moving with a jerky, unsettling gait. I called out, trying to sound authoritative, but my voice cracked. The figure stopped and turned its head slowly, revealing hollow, black eyes that seemed to absorb the light. I stumbled back, adrenaline surging through me. I remembered my training and reached for my radio, but the words got stuck in my throat. The figure didn't advance. It simply stood there, watching me. The woods around us felt like they were holding their breath, the air thick with anticipation. I turned and sprinted back down the path, my mind racing. I could hear branches snapping behind me and the sound of something following, moving faster than it should have been. As I ran, I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in on me, the trees towering like sentinels. I burst out onto the main trail and didn't stop until I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, and finally got inside, slamming the door shut. I took a moment to catch my breath before calling for backup, explaining the situation as calmly as I could, but inside I was a mess. While I waited for the other rangers to arrive, I decided to circle back to the campsite. Maybe I could find the family and lead them to safety. As I approached, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. The area looked different, almost distorted. I scanned the trees but saw no sign of the figure. The tent was still zipped up tight, and the campsite was eerily quiet. I crept closer, my flashlight beam trembling. I unzipped the tent once more, but this time, it was empty. My heart sank. Where had they gone? A rustling noise drew my attention again, and I turned just in time to see the figure dart between the trees. Panic surged, and I turned to run, but as I did, I tripped over something hidden in the leaves. I fell forward and looked back. The figure was right there, only inches from me. But as I scrambled to my feet, something strange happened. The creature changed shape, morphing into the father from the camping family, his face twisted with fear. I blinked, and he vanished, replaced by shadows that danced among the trees. I stumbled back toward the road, my mind racing with confusion. Just as I reached the trailhead, the other rangers arrived. I told them everything, but as we searched the woods, we found nothing. No campers, no sign of a struggle, just an overwhelming silence. Days later, the park officials declared the area closed until further notice. But sometimes, when I walk the trails alone at night, I can still hear the rustling of leaves and that haunting growl. I wonder if the woods still hold the family, or if they became part of something far darker. The figure I saw, the one that looked like the father, was never found, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever I encountered in those woods still lingers, watching and waiting. It was late October when I got called for an evening patrol deep in the woods. I had been a park ranger for a few years, but I had never seen the woods this empty. The leaves had turned vibrant shades of orange and red, but a chill in the air warned me that winter was creeping in. My radio crackled with static as I drove deeper into the forest. I flipped on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the dense trees. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods transformed into an eerie labyrinth of shadows. I stopped at a clearing where a family had set up camp. They were enjoying a quiet night by the fire, laughter echoing in the silence. I waved and continued on my patrol, reminding myself to check back later. The forest felt alive. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, and the distant hoot of an owl all combined to create an unsettling symphony. As night fell, the family's laughter faded into the distance, replaced by a profound silence. I made my way to the nearby trails, feeling the hairs on my neck prickle. It was then that I heard something a low, guttural growl, I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the direction of the family's campsite. I radioed dispatch, but received no response. Anxiety coursed through me as I made my way back to the clearing. The fire was now just glowing embers, the tent sagging and unlit. I called out, hoping for a reply. Silence. Then I saw a dark figure, lurking just beyond the tree line. My flashlight flickered, illuminating the creature for a split second. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and its eyes glowed like embers. I stepped back, my mind racing. It couldn't be real. I had to get to the family. As I ran, the air grew colder. I stumbled into the campsite, breathless and panicked. The tent was empty, and their belongings lay scattered. I yelled for them again, the sound echoing through the stillness. Just then, I heard a rustle behind me. I turned, flashlight raised, ready to confront whatever was there. The figure stepped into the light, but it wasn't what I expected. It was the father from the family, his eyes wide with fear. He looked disheveled, as if he had been running. He grabbed my arm, breathing heavily. "It's not safe here," he gasped. "We need to leave now." Before I could ask what happened, I heard the growl again, closer this time. The man's grip tightened. We rushed away from the campsite, stumbling through the underbrush. The darkness closed in around us, and I could feel the weight of something behind us. I led him toward the road, but just as we reached the edge of the forest, I glanced back and saw the creature. It was closer now, its twisted form illuminated by the moonlight. Panic surged through me, and I yelled for the father to hurry. We ran, pushing ourselves through the thick brush, the creature's growls echoing in the night. Just when I thought we would be overtaken, we burst out onto the road. The safety of the streetlights was a relief, but I dared not look back. We collapsed on the pavement, gasping for breath. I turned to the father, ready to ask what he had seen. His face was pale, eyes wide with disbelief. "We thought it was just a bear," he stammered. "But it wasn't. It was something else." As we sat there, catching our breath, I noticed the lights of my truck in the distance. Relief washed over me, but as I stood to head toward it, I glanced back one last time. The figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching us. It tilted its head, and in that moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Where its mouth should have been was an empty, gaping hole, just a dark void. In that instant, everything shifted. I turned to the father, ready to shout a warning, but before I could speak, he collapsed. I rushed to him, panic setting in. He was gone, lifeless, but the terror wasn't over. As I looked back toward the woods, the figure was now gone, just darkness. The weight of dread settled in my stomach, and I realized the truth. It hadn't been just a creature, it had been feeding on fear. I got up, my heart racing. I sprinted toward my truck, knowing the woods held more secrets than I had ever imagined. Whatever had taken that family was still out there, waiting for its next victim. I have always loved the solitude of the deep woods. As a park ranger, I spent my days monitoring trails, maintaining campsites, and ensuring that everyone enjoyed their time in nature safely. One chilly autumn evening, I was assigned the last shift of the season, just as the leaves were starting to fall and the air turned crisp. Little did I know that this night would change my perspective on the forest forever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I set out on my usual patrol. The trees towered over me, their skeletal branches swaying in the wind. I could hear the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, a sound that usually brought me comfort, but tonight it felt ominous. I had always been aware of the stories the locals spoke of strange happenings in these woods, whispers of creatures lurking just beyond the trees. I never paid them much mind, chalking it up to urban legends meant to scare children. About an hour into my shift, I noticed something unusual. Off the main trail, a flickering light danced through the trees. My curiosity piqued. I cautiously approached, thinking it might be a group of campers in need of help. As I got closer, the light vanished, swallowed by the darkness. A shiver ran down my spine. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the night. As I turned back to the path, I heard a soft rustling sound, like someone moving through the underbrush. I glanced over my shoulder, but the forest was still. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just a deer or maybe the wind playing tricks. However, the feeling of being watched pressed heavily on my chest. I continued my patrol, but the unease lingered. As I approached the campsite where a family was staying, I noticed their tent was zipped shut, and the campfire was still burning, casting flickering shadows. I called out to them, but there was no response. I stepped closer, peering inside the tent, and saw it empty, with no sign of the family. My heart raced. Where could they have gone? Just then, a loud crash echoed through the trees, followed by a chilling scream. The sound came from deeper in the woods, sending my adrenaline into overdrive. I sprinted towards the source, fear gripping my heart. Each step felt heavier, and the darkness seemed to stretch out before me. Waiting. As I reached a small clearing, I stumbled upon something terrifying. The ground was torn up, as if a massive animal had been digging frantically. The scream had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I scanned the area with my flashlight, my beam cutting through the darkness, revealing twisted branches and the scattered remnants of what looked like a picnic, broken plates, an overturned cooler. Then I saw a shadow moving between the trees. My heart raced as I called out again, this time louder. The shadow paused, and for a moment, I thought I saw a face, pale and twisted, staring back at me. It vanished before I could process what I had seen. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I turned to flee back towards the trail. In my panic, I tripped over a root and fell to the ground. As I scrambled to my feet, I heard a low growl emanating from the darkness. It sounded closer now. My instincts kicked in, and I ran, branches scratching at my arms as I pushed through the underbrush. I had to get back to my truck, back to safety. Finally, I burst out onto the main path, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I turned back, scanning the shadows. Nothing followed. I reached my truck, fumbling for the keys as the growl echoed in my mind. Just as I was about to start the engine, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. The family I had thought was missing stood just outside the tree line. They appeared disheveled, eyes wide with terror, but unharmed. I leapt out, relieved they were safe. As I approached, I noticed something behind them. The twisted figure I had seen earlier was standing silently, its grotesque form illuminated by the headlights of my truck. But instead of lunging at us, it simply stood there, watching. The family had been lost, but had found their way back when they heard the scream, which was not their own, but rather a warning to escape. The creature, whatever it was, had been trying to protect them from something far worse lurking deeper in the woods. We stood together in shock, realizing that sometimes the real monsters are the unseen forces that drive fear into our hearts. With the morning light creeping in, we hurried out of the woods, grateful to have survived the night, but forever haunted by what we had encountered in the shadows. As a park ranger, I had grown accustomed to the eerie stillness of the woods. It was mid-October, and the vibrant autumn leaves painted the landscape in fiery reds and oranges. Most visitors had left, leaving the park in a haunting solitude that felt almost alive. I was patrolling the area when I received a call over the radio. A family had reported hearing strange noises outside their tent, something that sounded large and menacing. I set out on foot, a flashlight in hand, my heart racing. The night air was thick with tension, and the shadows loomed ominously among the trees. The path to the campsite felt longer than usual, each snap of a twig underfoot echoing in the stillness. The family had set up camp deep in the woods, far away from the main trails. As I approached, I noticed an unusual quiet, the kind of silence that seems to hold its breath. When I reached their campsite, the tension in the air became palpable. The tent was unzipped but empty, their belongings strewn about haphazardly. My gut twisted as I called out for them. No response. I stepped inside the tent, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Everything appeared untouched, but the unsettling absence of the family gnawed at me. I heard it then, a low growl that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled back outside, scanning the perimeter. My heart raced as I noticed fresh claw marks on the ground, deep and jagged, surrounding the tent. I cursed under my breath, my instinct screaming that something was very wrong. I should have turned back then, but my ranger training kicked in. I had to find them. I ventured deeper into the woods, calling out for the family. The growl reverberated through the trees again, closer this time. It was guttural, a sound that belonged to something primal. Suddenly, a figure darted through the trees, its movement too swift for a human. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of tall, lanky silhouette with glowing eyes. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, the darkness swallowing my light. I turned and ran, branches scratching at my arms as I darted through the underbrush. I heard it behind me, its growl morphing into a harsh cackle that pierced the night. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline pumping through my veins, desperate to escape whatever hunted me. Finally, I burst onto a familiar trail, breathless and disoriented. I fumbled for my radio, calling for backup, my voice a frantic whisper in the static. I didn't want to admit how scared I was, but fear clawed at my insides. As I waited, I could hear the rustling in the bushes, that low growl echoing closer. I turned, prepared to face whatever came next. Moments later, another ranger arrived, flashlight beaming into the dark. Relief washed over me, but I quickly warned him of the creature. We gathered our courage and approached the family's campsite, but the creature was gone. The only signs of disturbance were the deep claw marks and the ransacked tent. Then we heard its screams coming from deeper in the woods. My stomach twisted as we sprinted toward the sound, hearts pounding. What if we were too late? As we reached a clearing, we saw the family huddled together, terrified but unharmed. The relief was overwhelming until I turned to see what they were pointing at. In the center of the clearing stood the creature, its long limbs twitching and contorting in unnatural ways. But then I realized something horrifying. The creature was mimicking the father's voice. "Help me," it called, but the tone was twisted, dripping with malice. It wasn't just a monster. It was a horrifying imitation, feeding on their fear. In that moment, everything clicked. The growls were not of a beast, but of a being capable of deception. It fed on the fear of its prey, luring them into the darkness. We backed away slowly, not daring to turn our backs on it, the family still frozen in shock. My heart raced as I realized our only chance was to leave this clearing. We moved together, inching backward until we were out of its reach. The creature screeched in frustration, the sound echoing through the trees. I grabbed the family's arms, urging them to run. The woods felt alive with danger as we raced back to safety, knowing we had escaped a fate worse than we could imagine. As we reached the edge of the park, I glanced back at the dark woods, knowing the true horror had only just begun. I always thought being a park ranger would be a peaceful job. I spent my days hiking the trails, keeping an eye on the wildlife, and sharing my love for the outdoors with visitors. But that all changed one fateful autumn night. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I wrapped up my last patrol and headed back to the ranger station. The woods took on a different feel after dark, and even though I was alone, I felt a strange sense of unease. I locked up the station and decided to take a short walk before heading home. There was something about the silence that drew me in. I wandered deeper into the woods, the flashlight beam dancing between the trees. The familiar paths felt different in the dark, and every crack of a twig made my heart race. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise, a low, grating sound. It seemed to come from somewhere nearby. I stopped, holding my breath, and listened. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered in the forest. It sounded almost like someone whispering, but there was a raspy edge to it. I shivered, dismissing it as my imagination running wild. Continuing my walk, I stumbled upon an old camping site. The fire pit was cold, the logs arranged haphazardly. I remembered this spot. It was a popular camping area for families. I pulled out my radio, ready to check in with the other rangers, when I noticed something strange. There were two sets of footprints leading away from the site, but they were mixed with something else, something that looked like claw marks. My heart began to pound as I knelt to inspect them. The prints were large, almost too big to belong to any animal in the area. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light. But the feeling of being watched crept back in. I stood up, suddenly feeling exposed. That's when I heard it again, the grating whispering. It was closer this time. I swung my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. I stepped back, feeling a chill run down my spine. The whispers intensified, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run. I turned and sprinted back toward the path, the light bouncing erratically in front of me. Just as I rounded a corner, my foot caught on a root, and I stumbled forward, crashing to the ground. The flashlight flew from my hand, extinguishing the only source of light. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to turn it back on. In the darkness, the whispers became louder, almost mocking. I finally managed to get it working again and aimed the beam into the trees. I was greeted by a horrifying sight. Standing just outside the circle of light was a figure. Tall and thin, with long, gangly limbs. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the trees. My breath caught in my throat. I bolted to my feet and ran. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, echoing all around me. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I raced down the path. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it and leaned against it, panting heavily. After a few moments, I forced myself to calm down. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. I was just tired from my long day. I flipped the light on and checked my radio. Just as I was about to call it a night, a chilling sound broke through the silence. A soft knock echoed from the door. My heart raced as I approached, hesitantly peering through the window. Outside stood a family: mom, dad, and 2 kids, looking lost and frightened. They explained they had been camping nearby when they heard strange sounds and saw a figure in the woods. They had fled, thinking they would find help. My body relaxed, relieved that I wasn't alone in this. I welcomed them in and made them comfortable while I called for assistance. They described the whispers and the figure, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. As I turned to grab some extra blankets, I glanced back at the window, and that's when I saw it again. The tall, thin figure was standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. But this time, it wasn't alone. The trees were alive with movement, and all around the figure were dozens of those same twisted silhouettes, all staring in silence. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I wasn't crazy. The whispers hadn't been in my head. The forest had been hiding something much darker all along. The family beside me had unwittingly stumbled into something I had barely escaped, and now it felt like it was closing in. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights patrolling the deep woods. The stars overhead shine brightly, casting an ethereal glow on the forest floor. But there are times when that beauty feels sinister. One October night, my shift began like any other, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. I was out on the usual trail, checking campsites and making sure everything was in order. The air was crisp, and the wind whispered through the trees, sending chills down my spine. I had just finished my rounds when I got a call on the radio from a couple camping a few miles deeper in the woods. They reported strange noises outside their tent, things that sounded like whispers and shuffling feet. I told them I would head over immediately, assuring them it was probably just the wind. As I hiked through the dense underbrush, unease settled in my stomach. The noises they described didn't sit well with me. I picked up my pace, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing the gnarled roots and thick brush. The deeper I went, the darker it became. My flashlight flickered intermittently, and I mentally cursed the batteries. Finally, I reached the couple's campsite. Their tent was pitched, but eerily quiet. I called out to them, but there was no response. I approached the tent and carefully unzipped it, peering inside. It was empty. Sleeping bags were still rolled up, their belongings neatly stowed, but they were nowhere to be found. My heart raced. I stepped back, scanning the surrounding area for any signs of struggle or distress. That's when I heard it, a low growl, reverberating through the trees. I felt it in my bones, a primal sound that struck fear into my heart. I quickly turned, shining my flashlight in every direction. The forest was still, but I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows. I radioed for backup, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the tremor creeping in. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement behind a nearby tree. I shined my flashlight toward it. A figure stood there, half hidden in the shadows. It looked like a man, but was unnaturally thin, almost emaciated. His skin glimmered in the flashlight's beam, pale and sickly. He held a hand up as if trying to shield himself from the light. But what struck me were his eyes. They were wide and wild, filled with an unsettling mix of fear and hunger. I stumbled back, my breath quickening as I fought the urge to scream. The man stepped forward, and I could see he was not quite right. His movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. the growl still echoing behind me. I darted through the trees, branches scratching at my arms and face. I didn't stop to look back, driven by instinct. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, every shadow morphing into something sinister. I finally reached the main path and sprinted toward my truck, fumbling with my keys as I desperately tried to get the engine to start. Just as I pulled away, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. The figure stood at the edge of the forest, illuminated by my headlights. But as I drove away, my pulse racing, I realized I hadn't seen him alone. I had glimpsed a couple huddled behind him, their eyes wide with terror, as if they were under some kind of spell. I returned to the ranger station and reported everything. We launched a search team back into the woods, but when we arrived, there was no sign of the couple. The area was as quiet as it had been when I first found the tent. The park was deemed safe, but I knew what I had seen. The ranger community brushed it off as a story, a figment of my imagination after being out in the woods too long. Years later, I still hear whispers when the wind howls through the trees. I've moved on, taking a different job away from the woods, but something lingers in my mind. I wonder if the couple ever made it out. Or perhaps they are still there, trapped in that darkness, forever watching the woods for the next park ranger who dares to venture too close. I had always loved the deep woods. As a park ranger, I spent my days exploring trails and checking on campers. That summer had been particularly quiet. Most families had left for the season, and I found myself patrolling areas that were usually bustling with life. The trees stood like silent sentinels, and the sounds of the forest seemed amplified in the stillness. One late afternoon, I received a call on the radio from a family camping deep in the woods. They reported strange noises outside their tent. At first, I brushed it off as wildlife, perhaps a deer or a raccoon, but the father's voice trembled with fear as he described the sounds. It was too rhythmic, he insisted, not like anything they had heard before. Something in his tone sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed my gear and made my way to their campsite, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. The sun dipped below the horizon, and shadows stretched long and thin across the ground. As I walked, the familiar path became less inviting, the air heavy with an unshakable sense of dread. I reached the campsite as darkness fell, and the only light came from the flickering glow of their campfire. The family, a mother, father, and 2 children, sat huddled together, their faces pale. They explained that the noises had started as low growls, but soon morphed into something more unsettling and eerie chanting that seemed to echo through the trees. I scanned the area, feeling the weight of their fear settling in my chest. The father pointed toward the woods, his finger trembling. It was then that I heard a distant, rhythmic sound that pierced through the silence. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. The chant was muffled, yet it resonated with an unnatural quality that made my skin crawl. I felt a chill wind swirl around us, sending leaves swirling in chaotic patterns. I told the family to stay by the fire, and I stepped away, shining my flashlight into the darkened woods. The beam danced nervously over the trees, illuminating nothing but the bark and shadows. The chanting seemed to grow louder, creeping closer. I retraced my steps back to the family, but just as I turned, I noticed something moving in the darkness. A tall figure slipped between the trees, its form almost blending into the night. I swallowed hard, convinced my imagination was playing tricks on me. It wasn't unusual for rangers to feel unnerved at night, but I felt compelled to investigate. I told the family to stay put and quietly approached the edge of the forest. The chanting stopped, replaced by unsettling silence that pressed down on me like a weight. As I stepped deeper into the trees, the atmosphere shifted. The air turned cold, and the familiar sounds of the woods faded away. I could hear only my heartbeat echoing in my ears, pounding louder as I ventured further into the unknown. I trained my flashlight on the path ahead, but the beam flickered ominously, threatening to go out completely. Suddenly, the chanting erupted again, louder and more urgent. I could feel it reverberate through my bones. It seemed to come from all around me, as if the trees themselves were alive and whispering secrets. Panic surged within me, but I pushed forward, determined to uncover the source. Then I saw a circle of strange symbols etched into the ground, surrounded by twisted branches that formed a crude barrier. The figure I had seen earlier stood at the center, but it was not human. It was tall and thin, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes that reflected my flashlight like mirrors. My breath caught in my throat as it turned toward me, its face a void, a black pit that seemed to swallow the light. I stumbled back, heart racing, but the family was just behind me, having followed out of concern. I turned to them, shouting for them to run, but before I could react, the figure lunged. I stumbled backward, expecting the worst, but instead, the ground erupted in a flash of light. The symbols glowed bright, illuminating the woods for a brief moment, before plunging everything back into darkness. The creature vanished, leaving only a lingering echo of its chant behind. The family looked at me, their faces a mix of fear and confusion. I led them back to the campsite, my heart still pounding. The strange occurrences continued through the night, but we remained together, the family's presence grounding me. In the morning, we reported everything to the authorities, but when the search teams returned to the site, they found nothing, no symbols, no signs of the creature. The family and I were left with our memories, the knowledge of what we had experienced buried within us. As the family packed up to leave, I realized something chilling. The chanting had stopped, but the echo of those glowing eyes lingered in my mind, a haunting reminder that sometimes the woods hold secrets best left undiscovered. It was late October when I signed up for a solo shift as a park ranger, patrolling the trails after dark. The deep woods were always eerie at night, but there was something about the fall air that made the trees seem closer, the shadows thicker. I had patrolled the park dozens of times before, but something about that night felt different. My flashlight was weak, its beam barely cutting through the mist that had settled over the forest. The towering pines creaked in the wind as I made my way down one of the less traveled paths. I had heard stories over the years, rumors about strange things happening deep in these woods. Most of the time, it was just old campers telling ghost stories around a fire. I never believed them until that night. As I moved deeper into the woods, I came across an old campsite. The fire pit was cold, and the tent looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. There were no signs of wildlife, no rustling of leaves or chirping of insects. The stillness was unnerving. I radioed in to let the others know I had found the site, but there was no response, just static. My heart began to race. I should have turned back, but something compelled me to go further. A thick fog had started to roll in, making it even harder to see. The path twisted and narrowed, and soon I found myself in an area of the park I had never seen before. I didn't recognize any of the landmarks. I checked my map and compass, but neither seemed to make sense. The compass needle spun wildly, as if it were confused, and the map didn't match my surroundings. Panic started to creep in. I wasn't lost, I couldn't be. Suddenly, I heard a sound. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of trees, it was something else. A low, guttural moan echoed through the woods, followed by the snap of a branch. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving between the trees. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was tall to tall. My instinct was to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood frozen, staring into the darkness, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. The sound came again, closer this time. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my breath shallow. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The forest was silent once more. I forced myself to move, slowly backing away from the direction of the sound. I had to get back to the main trail, back to the ranger station. But no matter which way I turned, the trees seemed to close in on me, blocking my way. As I stumbled through the fog, I saw something ahead, to glowing orbs floating in the distance. My heart leapt into my throat. They were eyes, reflecting in the beam of my flashlight. They were watching me. I pointed the light straight at them, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something large and gaunt, standing just beyond the fog. It looked human, but its limbs were elongated, and its skin was pale as moonlight. It didn't move, just stood there, staring. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. My legs burned as I sprinted through the trees, branches slashing at my face and arms. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, moving faster than any human could. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like an eternity, I burst into a clearing. My chest heaved, and my body ached, but I didn't stop. I ran until I saw the faint glow of the ranger station's lights in the distance. I threw myself through the door and locked it behind me. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, I returned to the area with another ranger. The fog had lifted, and the woods looked normal, peaceful even. But when we reached the clearing where I had first seen the creature, we found something strange. There, in the soft earth, were footprints, giant human-like prints, much larger than any person's. They led deep into the woods and disappeared into the darkness. We never spoke about it again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there had let me go. It had been watching, waiting, and it knew I would come back. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights in the deep woods, patrolling the trails and ensuring the safety of campers. I thought I'd seen it all until one autumn evening when everything changed. It was late October, and the air was crisp with the promise of an early frost. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I was on my usual patrol route when I noticed something strange, a flickering light deep within the forest. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just a camper trying to set up their fire. But something about the light felt off. It wasn't steady like a campfire. It danced erratically, almost like it was alive. Curiosity got the better of me. I hiked toward the light, my boots crunching on the fallen leaves. As I drew closer, I heard laughter, high-pitched and disjointed, echoing through the trees. It sent a shiver down my spine. The laughter was not the joyful sound of campers enjoying themselves. It felt sinister, mocking. I hesitated, torn between my duty to investigate and the instinct to turn back. Just then, my radio crackled to life. Another ranger was calling in a report of strange noises coming from the woods. He described something similar, a flickering light and laughter that didn't sound human. My heart raced. This wasn't just my imagination. Something was happening. I pushed on, forcing myself to focus. As I neared the source of the light, I stumbled into a clearing. The sight took my breath away. In the center stood a large bonfire, flames leaping high into the night sky. Around it danced a group of figures, their movements jerky and erratic. They wore ragged clothes and masks made of twigs and leaves, their faces obscured. They twisted and spun, their laughter growing louder, filling the air with a chaotic energy. Frozen in place. I watched as they danced around the fire. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I needed to gather information. Suddenly, one of them turned, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. Its gaze pierced through me, and I felt a chill seep into my bones. In that instant, I realized they weren't human. As if sensing my fear, the group stopped dancing and turned to face me. The leader stepped forward, its mask peeling back to reveal a face that was not a face at all, just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes and mouth should be. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as I turned to flee. I ran through the forest, branches snagging at my clothes, the laughter of the figures echoing behind me, taunting. I raced back toward my truck, my lungs burning. I could still hear them behind me, their laughter morphing into a cacophony of whispers, chanting my name. It felt like they were calling me, urging me to join their twisted celebration. I reached my truck, fumbled with the keys, and slammed the door shut. I locked it, trembling as I glanced back at the dark woods. Just as I started the engine, I saw movement in the rearview mirror. One of the figures was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at me, its head cocked to one side. I peeled out of the parking lot, my heart racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had never driven so fast down those narrow, winding roads. Finally, I reached the ranger station. I burst through the doors, breathless, and tried to explain what I had seen. But the other rangers dismissed my fears. They insisted it was likely a group of pranksters or local kids playing tricks. They laughed it off, saying I was just spooked by the dark, but I knew what I had seen. I decided to take a group back with me to the clearing, determined to prove I wasn't imagining things. We hiked back to the spot, but the fire was gone. The clearing was empty, devoid of any sign of life. The laughter had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. We searched the area, but there was nothing, no tracks, no burned logs, just the whispering wind through the trees. As we started to leave, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, an old, gnarled tree with a deep hollow in its trunk. I approached it, feeling a strange pull. Inside the hollow was a collection of masks, just like the ones I had seen that night. Each mask was crafted from twisted branches and leaves. Eerily familiar. It struck me then, I had not escaped them at all. They had wanted me to see, to witness their world. I had thought I was the one investigating, but I was merely a visitor in their realm. As we left the clearing, I felt a chilling realization settle in. They were still watching, still waiting, and the forest held secrets that would never be unearthed.